Who killed Michael Townley? The answer appeared in federal records within hours of a botched heist in a snow-covered town called Ludendorff. FIB Special Agent Dave Norton. December 2004. The most wanted bank robber in America ended during his final job in North Yankton. The commendation came next, a career that had been, up to that morning, unremarkable by any federal measure, no major arrests, no landmark cases, nothing worth hanging on a wall, suddenly had something to point to. Dave Norton got Townley. The case was closed. For 9 years the story held. Nobody dug into it because the story was clean and the man it pointed to was dead, buried in Ludendorff Cemetery. Headstone and everything, but Michael Townley was not in that grave. He was in a Rockford Hills mansion in Los Santos, San Andreas, going by a different name, arguing with his wife, and sending Dave Norton a 5-figure check every single month. And the man in the grave, the actual body under Michael Townley's headstone, was named Brad Snider. He had been shot in the chest on the same morning Dave Norton supposedly killed Townley. He had not been the target. He had stepped in front of someone else's bullet at exactly the wrong moment. That is how this whole thing started. Not with a clean kill, not with a decisive federal operation, with an accident and a deal, and a man who needed a win so badly he was willing to build an entire fiction around it. This is the story of Dave Norton, the FIB agent who didn't kill a criminal, the agent who helped one disappear instead, the man who spent 9 years managing a secret, then got pulled back into the orbit of that secret when the one person who could have destroyed it finally came looking. Dave is not the loudest character in GTA 5. He doesn't blow things up. He doesn't conduct torture sessions. He doesn't kidnap anyone's wife. What Dave does is keep the machinery running, the quiet, grinding machinery of a lie that was always going to break eventually. This is how it broke, and what happened to the man who built it. The public record on Dave Norton is thin. That's the first thing worth noting. For a man at the center of one of the most consequential cover-ups in GTA 5's entire timeline, very little is actually documented about him, not where he grew up, not when he joined the FIB, not what his early cases looked like, or what kind of agent he was before December 2004 changed everything. He exists in the institutional record the way a lot of men in his position exist, as a job title, a badge number, a name attached to a single career-defining outcome that obscures the decades of unremarkable work that preceded it. His file, as described by Lester Crest in 2013, had been unremarkable. That particular word carries specific weight when it comes from Lester, who has a habit of reducing complicated people to their most accurate single description. Lester doesn't waste words, and he doesn't use imprecise ones. When he says Dave Norton's career had been unremarkable, he means it precisely. Not merely unimpressive, not simply quiet, but without a single mark worth remarking on. A federal career measured in decades and producing nothing. So we start with the record as it was written, because the record is the structure the story depends on. According to the official version, Dave Norton was the FIB agent who tracked down Michael Townley, a career bank robber with federal warrants across multiple states, operating with a crew in the Midwest, and neutralized him during a heist at the Bobcat Security Cash Storage Facility in Ludendorff, North Yankton. The year was 2004. The month was December. The operation, as documented in whatever official paperwork Dave subsequently filed, was a successful interception of a wanted criminal in the act of committing a crime. Michael Townley was shot and killed. One of his 2 associates, Brad Snider, was also shot. The third member of the crew, Trevor Phillips, evaded capture and disappeared. Dave Norton received full credit for the operation. His career moved upward, not dramatically, not into the kind of territory that puts an agent on television or earns him a press conference, but upward. He was reassigned from whatever posting he'd been occupying in the Midwest to the FIB's Los Santos division in San Andreas. He was folded into the unit run by Steve Haines, who at that point was a rising figure within the bureau, and the kind of supervisor whose name carried enough weight to make an assignment to his unit feel like a step forward rather than a lateral move. Dave Norton, formerly Unremarkable, became the agent who had taken down the most wanted bank robber in America. That's how careers get made, inside institutions like the FIB, not always through sustained excellence or consistent results, but through a single defining outcome that reshapes everything around it. Dave had that outcome. He had the file, he had the commendation, he had the reassignment to a major city with a high-profile unit under a connected supervisor, everything the institutional logic of a federal law enforcement career requires. Dave suddenly possessed, and every single element of it rested on a foundation that had never existed. The actual record, the one that lived only in two men's memories and one secret arrangement conducted without paperwork or oversight or any legal mechanism that could be called legitimate, was something else entirely. But before we get there, it's worth understanding what the official record actually did for Dave Norton in practical terms, because the gap between what happened and what was written down is not just a criminal matter. It is the entire reason GTA 5 exists as a story. Think about the FIB as an institution. It is, in the GTA universe, a federal law enforcement body that functions approximately the way you'd expect a powerful national agency to function, except with considerably more internal corruption, considerably more budget competition, and considerably more interest in institutional survival than in anything resembling justice. It is an organization of men and women competing for resources, for promotions, for cases that will get them in front of the right people at the right time. A man with an unremarkable career in that environment is not simply failing to advance. He is slowly becoming invisible. Every year without a major result is a year where the interesting cases go to someone else, where the assignments compound into a pile of low visibility work that nobody above you is watching, where you become the kind of agent who gets the dull tasks because nobody expects much and the outcome either way doesn't affect anyone's quarterly review. Dave Norton, before 2004, was living that particular slow disappearance. Then his record acquired Michael Townley's name. The reassignment to Los Santos put Dave in a different category, not a famous agent, not a celebrated one, but one with something to point to, one who had demonstrated the capacity for a result. That matters inside agencies like the FIB, where results are the primary currency and where a single significant result can sustain a career for years while the agent in question coasts on its momentum. Dave coasted on its momentum for 9 years. Now, if you're settling in for this kind of content, the deep character studies and the lore that lives underneath the missions, this is exactly where you want to be. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Dave Norton's story is just getting started, and what comes next is where it becomes genuinely strange. The FIB as an institution is worth understanding in a bit more detail before we go further, because the gap between what the FIB presents to the outside world and what it actually is on the inside matters enormously to everything Dave Norton did. In the GTA universe, the Federal Investigation Bureau is modeled closely enough on a real federal law enforcement body that the comparison is obvious and intentional. It has a public face, the decorated agents, the press releases, the television appearances, the budget justifications delivered to congressional committees with the practiced sincerity of people who have been doing this long enough to believe the version they're presenting. It has a private face, the unit-level corruption, the interagency rivalries that consume more operational energy than any actual case, the budget competitions that determine which units get resources and which get quietly starved until they stop mattering, and the specific culture of men and women who have spent years accumulating institutional knowledge and are unwilling to apply that knowledge in ways that threaten their own position. Dave Norton spent his pre-2004 career in the public face. He filed reports, he attended briefings, he took on cases that were assigned to him by people higher up the chain and worked them to conclusions that were either inconclusive or minor enough that nobody above him needed to pay attention to the outcome. He was present in the institution without being of consequence to it, and that is a specific and grinding kind of professional experience, to be inside something, to know its language and its rhythms and its politics, and to remain on the permanent outside of its actual decision-making. The commendation for the Townley case changed that. Not instantly, not dramatically, but it changed it. Dave Norton became a name that appeared in a different kind of conversation, a man with something that matters inside institutions where something is almost the only currency that generates real mobility. Back to December 2004, back to the morning the official record was written and what actually happened while it was being written. There's a reason Rockstar chose Ludendorff as the location for the prologue rather than a Los Santos backdrop or a more recognizable setting. Ludendorff is, by design, a place that doesn't register. It's the kind of town you drive through without stopping, the kind of town that shows up in reference without context. The Ludendorff job means the job, not the place, because the place is not the memorable part. It is backdrop by design. A stage set for an operation that was meant to happen quickly and leave no trace. That lack of distinctiveness is part of what made it work for so long. There was nothing memorable about Ludendorff that would pull attention back to it. No particular reason for an investigator casting around for loose threads in a federal case to look twice at a small North Yankton town. The cemetery where Brad Snider was buried under Michael Townley's name sat in a quiet part of a town nobody was looking at, and the grave sat in the cemetery without attracting the examination it would have attracted had it been located anywhere that people had reasons to return to. The choice of Ludendorff was operationally intelligent. Dave probably understood this. Michael almost certainly understood it. They had picked the location of Michael's disappearance with the same care they'd applied to the other elements of the arrangement, and the location had served its purpose. A grave in a place nobody visits, for a person nobody was going to miss from the right angles, until Trevor Phillips flew there from Sandy Shores Airfield on a December morning 9 years after it was dug. The Bobcat Security Cash Storage Facility sat in the quieter part of Ludendorff. It was not a difficult target. The town was small enough and the facility unremarkable enough that a 3-man crew with proper preparation could move through it without attracting the kind of attention that larger targets in larger cities guaranteed. December. Christmas decorations still visible in a few shop windows along the main street. A tree visible through the glass of the facility foyer. Michael Townley, Trevor Phillips, and Brad Snider hit the place with the efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the individual steps had stopped requiring active thought. They secured the hostages in a back room. Trevor wired the vault with explosive charges while Michael coordinated from the front. Michael detonated it by phone when Trevor was clear. They walked into the vault, walked out with just under $180,000 and headed for the escape route that Dave Norton had already positioned himself along. The escape was where it came apart. A Bobcat security guard, a man named Jaspers who had survived the initial lockdown by staying in the right part of the building, appeared at the exit door and caught Michael as he came through. Got a grip on his mask, pulled it loose, got enough of a look at his face that letting him walk away became a risk Michael couldn't calculate in the right direction. Michael told him to go. Jaspers held his ground. Trevor shot him in the head. The North Yankton State Patrol had been building outside while the job ran. The moment the crew emerged, they were already converging from 2 directions. The SUV they'd prepped for the run to the helicopter pickup made it as far as the Cavalry Boulevard railroad crossing before a freight train came through the intersection and clipped the vehicle hard enough to spin it off the road and into a tree, hard enough to end any possibility of driving it further. it's worth pausing on what Dave's position at Ludendorff actually required of him in human terms. He was a federal agent about to fire a live round at a person who was not wanted for a capital offence, who had not been charged with anything that carried the death penalty, who was not presenting an immediate mortal threat to Dave or to anyone else in Dave's immediate vicinity. He was going to shoot Trevor Phillips because shooting Trevor Phillips was part of a private arrangement Dave had made with another criminal for money without authorization. That is not a small thing to do. Dave Norton was not a man without a conscience. The game doesn't present him as someone who had crossed into violence without awareness of what crossing into it meant. He was a man who had calculated that the benefits of the arrangement outweighed the moral cost of the action it required, and who had arrived at that calculation through the specific kind of moral reasoning that desperate people in institutional environments sometimes reach, where the alternative is so clearly bad that the action required begins to seem, if not right, then at least not worse. The alternative was continuing to be invisible, continuing to be unremarkable, continuing to watch other men advance past him in a career he'd given years to, and that had given him nothing back. Dave had done that calculation and reached an answer. The answer required him to stand in the snow in Ludendorff with a rifle and pull the trigger. He pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the wrong person. And in the seconds after Brad Snider dropped, in the space between the shot and the blank, Dave still needed to fire at Michael. Dave Norton had to process the fact that he had just killed a man he had not intended to kill, and that the plan built around a clean double neutralization had collapsed into something that required improvisation before anyone had time to recover from the initial shock of it. He fired the blank at Michael. He watched Michael fall. Whatever Dave felt in that moment, regret, panic, the specific coldness of a man who has done something he cannot undo and is already moving toward managing its consequences rather than sitting with its reality, the game doesn't record. What the game records is what Dave did afterward, which was everything necessary to make the worst possible version of the outcome look like the intended one. 3 men climbed out of a wrecked vehicle in the snow, police closing from multiple angles, helicopter pickup still some distance ahead. They ran, and from a position around a corner, set up before the job even started, Dave Norton waited with a sniper rifle. He was aiming at Trevor Phillips. He had one objective. He fired. Brad Snider stepped into the line of fire. That is the moment the plan became something else entirely, and that is where the official record diverges most completely from what actually happened, because the commendation Dave Norton received said he shot Michael Townley, and the truth was that he shot the wrong man by accident, fired a blank at the right one, and managed the wreckage of a plan that had collapsed in the space of about 30 seconds. Before the deal, before Ludendorff, before the sniper position and the blank round and the funeral in the snow, Dave Norton was not a particularly interesting person. That description is not an insult. It's a diagnosis. And it's the diagnosis the game provides through Lester Crest, who has no interest in softening things when the precise truth is available. Lester's sentence for Dave Norton: his career had been unremarkable. One word: precise and complete. Dave Norton had been a federal agent for long enough to have something to show for it, and what he had to show for it was nothing worth noting. The rest of what we know about Dave before 2004 amounts to very little. He was married at some point. The marriage ended. His ex-wife has no name anywhere in the game. She exists as a biographical footnote, a line of context suggesting that Dave had a life before all this, and that life, like his career, had failed to hold together in the way lives are supposed to. Whatever the marriage was, whatever combination of long hours and middling results, and the specific disappointment of watching a person you chose fail to become who you needed them to be, or vice versa, it dissolved. Dave was alone by the time any of this started. What remained was a man in his late 40s, working at a level in a federal agency that rewards results, producing none. To understand what that means specifically inside the FIB, you have to understand something about how agencies like the FIB actually function on the inside, past the institutional language and the badge and the sense of mission that recruits get talked through at the academy. The Federal Investigation Bureau, as Rockstar depicts it in GTA 5, is not primarily a law enforcement body in the practical sense. It is a bureaucratic organism. It has politics, budget cycles, internal competition for funding and profile, hierarchies of prestige that operate independently of rank and experience. Being a good investigator is useful inside an organization like that, but being a good investigator who produces results is essential, because results are the only language that matters to the people above you when they're deciding where resources go and whose career deserves the next assignment. A man without results is a man who slowly disappears. That's what was happening to Dave Norton before 2004, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment of professional failure, just the slow accumulating invisibility of a career that had never produced anything the institution needed to notice, cases that didn't land, operations that went nowhere, the kind of record that doesn't generate enemies because it doesn't generate enough attention to be worth anyone's opposition. You can't be resented if nobody is thinking about you. Dave was not being thought about. He was divorced. He was in his late 40s. He had a career that was, by any institutional measure, heading toward the unacknowledged end that a lot of mid-level federal careers reach, not fired, not forced out, just gradually sidelined until retirement becomes the only remaining event of any significance. He would have been the kind of agent whose retirement party gets attended out of obligation and forgotten within the week. Then he picked up Michael Townley's trail. The specific mechanism by which Dave located Michael is not something GTA 5 explains. Lester describes it as Dave having discovered the whereabouts of Michael Townley in Ludendorff, which is an elegant way of avoiding the question of how. Whether Dave methodically worked through the intelligence, whether a tip came through a contact, whether Michael's crew made an operational error that left a thread and Dave was the one who happened to be holding that particular thread, none of it is in the game. What the game makes clear is what Dave decided to do when he had it. A different agent, one who didn't feel the weight of years of invisibility, one who hadn't watched his personal life and professional life both fail to amount to what they were supposed to, would have reported it immediately, would have run it through the proper channels, organized a legitimate operation, and collected credit in the sanctioned way that federal agencies process success. The takedown would have been institutional. Dave would have been one of several people involved. His name would have appeared in a file as one contributor among others, but Dave had found this, him, without assistance, apparently, and the question he was asking himself, somewhere in the days or weeks between picking up the trail and deciding what to do with it, was whether following proper procedure was actually the best use of this particular piece of information. The answer he reached was no. He contacted Michael Townley directly, not through an attorney, not through any intermediary that created a record, just Dave, reaching out to the most wanted bank robber in America, offering a transaction. The offer was this: Michael would give Dave the crew. He would provide the date and location of an upcoming job. Dave would intercept it, shoot Trevor Phillips, arrest Brad Snider, and stage Michael's death with a blank round and a bulletproof vest. Michael would walk away legally dead. New name, new city, his family with him, his earnings from the previous years intact. Dave would walk away with the most wanted bank robber in America on his record, career-defining, uncontestable, plus the monthly payments, 5 figures, off the books, every month, for as long as both men were alive and the arrangement held. Michael said yes. That Michael said yes matters, and it's worth holding for a moment. Michael Townley was not coerced into this. He was not arrested and offered a deal in the presence of lawyers and with the machinery of the justice system visible around him. He was approached informally, given an option, and chose it. He chose to hand over Trevor and Brad. He chose the exit, the fake death, the monthly payments to a man who would hold the secret of his existence. He made that choice because Trevor Phillips, by 2004, had become something Michael genuinely feared, not in the way you fear an enemy, but in the way you fear someone you care about who is moving in a direction that is going to kill everyone nearby eventually. Trevor was becoming unmanageable, not unloyal. Trevor's loyalty, in his own terms, was absolute, but uncontrollable, increasingly willing to do things that expanded the risk for the entire operation in ways Michael couldn't calculate or contain. And Michael had Amanda. He had Jimmy, just a few years old. He had Tracy. He had a family living in the radius of a man who had nothing to lose and no exit plan, and the probability that this ended in someone's death was not declining. Dave offered Michael the exit. Michael took it. The mechanics of the new identity are worth lingering on. Michael DeSanta was not simply a name change, it was a complete legal reconstruction, the kind of identity fabrication that requires institutional cooperation to sustain over years. A new social security equivalent, a new residential history, documentation that placed Michael DeSanta in Los Santos long enough that his presence there would not raise questions if examined. This was not something Michael could have built himself. Dave's involvement in the FIB gave the new identity the institutional foundation it needed to function as more than a temporary cover. Dave, in other words, was not just the man who fired the blank and filed the false report. He was the ongoing infrastructure of Michael DeSanta's existence. Every time a background check on Michael DeSanta was run by a Los Santos institution, a bank, a school, a neighborhood association, anyone who might have a reason to examine the record of the person living in the Rockford Hills house, the federal files that Dave had access to and had shaped would have supported rather than undermined Michael's identity. Dave was embedded in the foundation. That's why the monthly payments made structural sense. Michael was not paying for silence exactly. He was paying for continued construction and maintenance of the identity he was living inside. The 5-figure monthly payment sustained over 9 years is also worth calculating in rough terms. Even at the conservative end, it's less $10,000 per month. 9 years of payments amounts to more than $1 million, entirely off the books, flowing from a criminal to a federal agent in exchange for a manufactured identity and a managed case file. At higher amounts in the range, $50,000, $75,000 per month, the number becomes considerably larger. Dave Norton, the unremarkable agent from the Midwest, was receiving the income of a senior criminal defense attorney in exchange for the management of one case file and one set of correspondence. His lifestyle in Los Santos, whatever it looked like, was considerably more comfortable than his federal salary alone would have made it. That is not a minor observation. The wealth generated by the arrangement, on Michael's side, by the savings on not being in prison, on Dave's side, by the monthly payments, is the material substance of what the deal produced for both men, and wealth, sustained over years, creates its own momentum, its own reasons to maintain the arrangement rather than risk it, its own gravity. Brad Snider's role in the original deal is worth examining in its own right, because Brad is usually discussed only in terms of what happened to him rather than what was supposed to happen to him. The plan called for Brad's arrest, not his death, not his disappearance, not his misidentification, his legitimate arrest and subsequent prosecution for his role in the Ludendorff Heist and the prior jobs in the crew's history. Brad would have become a federal prisoner, serving a sentence that reflected his actual criminal record, which was substantial. He would have been processed through the system. He would have had legal representation, a trial or a plea arrangement, a sentence, and eventually a release date. That outcome, Brad alive, incarcerated, subject to all the normal protections and limitations of the federal prison system, would have been, from Dave's perspective, manageable. A convicted criminal serving time cannot easily make claims about the nature of the operation that resulted in his arrest without those claims being filtered through the skepticism that attaches to convicted criminals making claims. Brad could have told anyone who would listen that Michael Townley was alive and that Dave Norton had fired a blank. The institutional response to that claim from inside a federal prison with a criminal record attached to the person making it would have been negligible. Dead, however, Brad became more complicated in one specific direction. Trevor. Trevor and Brad had a relationship that Dave had apparently not fully factored into the plan's riskiest element. Trevor believed in Brad in the specific way that Trevor believes in very few people, with the comprehensive loyalty that Trevor's psychology produces when he has decided someone is genuinely part of his inner circle. Brad's death, had Trevor known it was a death rather than an arrest, would have activated exactly the kind of sustained and focused investigation of circumstances that Dave needed Trevor not to conduct. The fiction of the arrest was not a secondary feature of the cover-up. It was the primary mechanism that kept Trevor pointed in the wrong direction. Dave had understood this correctly. He had built the Brad in prison narrative specifically for Trevor, and it had worked. What he had not fully anticipated was how much of his ongoing operational attention the maintenance of that narrative would require, and for how long. What he gave up in exchange was Brad and Trevor. And that is the part of the deal that gets lost sometimes in the larger mechanics of what follows. Michael did not accidentally betray his partners. He negotiated their fates in exchange for his own safety. He sat across from Dave Norton and agreed that Trevor would be shot and Brad would be arrested, and he did it with full knowledge of what that meant for both men. That's not a condemnation. GTA 5 is not interested in condemning Michael DeSanta. It spends most of its runtime studying him with something closer to compassion. But it is the truth of the deal. Dave Norton didn't create the arrangement unilaterally. He made an offer to a man who had his reasons to accept it, and that man accepted. 2 men, 1 deal, no paperwork, no witnesses, a job in Ludendorff in December, and an agreement about what would happen during it. The question of why Dave didn't simply run the operation through official channels, why he didn't report Michael Townley's location, organize a proper interdiction, and take institutional credit rather than personal credit, is one that reveals something important about where Dave was, psychologically, in 2004. An agent who has produced results gets to share the credit for those results with the system that enabled them. An operation organized through proper channels, with supervisors and logistics and official sanction, produces a result that belongs partly to the unit, partly to the supervisor who approved it, partly to the analyst who developed the intelligence, and partly to the agent who executed it. The commendation goes to the case file. The name that gets mentioned is one of several. Dave didn't have time for several. Dave didn't have the career trajectory that would be served by being one of several. Dave needed one thing, his name on it, and nobody else's. And the only way to achieve that was to conduct the operation in a way that made him the only person who knew the operation had happened before it happened. That's the logic of the decision, not recklessness, not corruption for its own sake. The specific calculation of a man who has watched how careers actually work inside institutions and concluded that the only way to change his own was to operate outside the institutional logic just this once, just enough to produce the outcome he needed. The irony is that the outcome he produced was far more than he needed. He didn't just get credit for a case. He got leverage over a man he was supposed to have killed, collected monthly payments from that man for 9 years, got promoted into Steve Haines' unit, and built a career that outlasted every other career in his immediate professional circle. He got more than he was reaching for, but the reach itself was the thing that started all of it. Dave Norton reached slightly beyond what the institution allowed in December 2004, and the reach never fully ended. Dave went to North Yankton with a sniper rifle and a plan. The plan lasted until Brad Snider stepped in front of his bullet. There is a line Michael DeSanta says during the mission, "Bury the hatchet," 9 years after everything was arranged, driving through Ludendorff in a rental car with his stomach turning over and his memories surfacing against his will. He thinks of the deal he made with a nice guy named Dave Norton. Hold that phrase, a nice guy, because whatever else is true about the arrangement they reached, and the things that are true about it, include an accidental death, a 9-year deception, and the systematic destruction of a man's ability to grieve his own friend. Michael Townley chose this. He was not dragged into it. He was offered a door, and he walked through it voluntarily. And the man on the other side of that door he remembered 9 years later while driving toward the worst moment of his adult life as nice. That tells you something about Dave Norton that neither the commendation nor the cover-up fully conveys. Dave was not brutal. He was not the kind of corrupt official who uses power as a weapon because the power itself is the thing he enjoys. He was pragmatic, methodical. He saw what each man in the transaction needed, and he structured something around those needs. That is not an admirable quality when what he structured was a fake death, an accidental killing, and 9 years of fraudulent correspondence with a dead man. But it is a real quality. Dave Norton was a nice guy doing something genuinely terrible, which is a more human description than villain, and also a more accurate one. Michael needed out. That's the foundation of why the deal worked. Michael Townley was not a man in search of meaning or driven by some consuming need to take things that didn't belong to him. He was a man with a family who had made a set of choices early in his life that had accumulated into a situation he could not reverse through conventional means. By 2004, he had Amanda, 2 young children, criminal earnings that had built a comfortable life around the edges of an increasingly dangerous enterprise, and a partner in Trevor Phillips who was becoming, month by month, a person that Michael could not predict or contain. Trevor, by 2004, was what Rockstar's writers would spend all of GTA 5 exploring in elaborate detail, a man of genuine capability and genuine savagery, with no moderating force in his life and no particular interest in acquiring one. He was loyal in his own absolute and non-transferable way. He was brilliant at the operational side of what they did. He was also increasingly willing to take actions that expanded risk for the entire crew in ways that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with the particular fire that burned in Trevor at all times. He hurt people, he drew attention, he escalated situations past the point where escalation was operationally useful, because escalation was sometimes what Trevor needed and the job was a secondary consideration. Michael had children. Michael had a wife, even if the marriage was already starting to corrode around the edges in the specific way that marriages corrode when one person is carrying secrets the other can't know. Michael had reasons to want a life in which his continued existence was not dependent on Trevor Phillips' continued ability to make reasonable decisions under pressure. Dave's offer was the mechanism. In exchange, Dave needed a result. Not just any result, the result. The most wanted bank robber in America, taken down during an active job. That's the kind of close that reshapes a career's narrative entirely. It converts years of unremarkable performance into something that looks, from the outside, like patient work that finally culminated. It gives the institutional record a capstone that casts everything before it in a different light. The years of producing nothing become, retroactively, the years before the big one. So the deal took shape around both men's needs, and it was specific in its terms. Michael would provide the intelligence, the date and location of the Ludendorff job, the composition of the crew, the escape route, the timing of the operation. Dave would position himself along the escape route with a rifle. During the escape, he would shoot Trevor Phillips, the variable that needed to be neutralized. Brad Snider would be arrested by the North Yankton State Patrol, who would be alerted and in position. Michael would take a blank round from Dave's rifle, fall convincingly, and remain still while the scene was processed. Then, a grave, a headstone, Michael Townley officially dead, and Michael DeSanta somewhere in Los Santos with his family and his earnings and a new name and a monthly obligation to the man who made all of it possible. The 5-figure monthly payment was not a detail added reluctantly, it was structural. Dave understood something fundamental about the nature of the arrangement. The deal's leverage ran both ways. He had something on Michael, the manufactured death, the deliberate misfiling of a federal case, the cover-up of a crime that he was paid to solve, but Michael had something on Dave, the entire fraudulent operation, documented in every fake report and fabricated outcome that Dave had filed. They were bound together by mutual vulnerability. The monthly payment made that binding financial, which made it tangible, which made it harder to walk away from. It was not a thank you, it was not tribute, it was a retainer. Dave would protect Michael and keep quiet. Michael would pay him to keep quiet, every month, off the books. Both men entered this arrangement with full knowledge of what it required from them. What neither man fully accounted for was the variable neither of them controlled. Trevor Phillips was supposed to be shot during the Ludendorff escape. That was the plan's core requirement, the one element that had to work for everything else to hold. With Trevor dead, there was nobody alive who knew the real arrangement. Brad would be in custody, grieving a partner he'd seen shot and believing Michael dead. The FIB would have a closed case. Michael would have a new life. With Trevor alive, none of the rest of it was stable, ever. Dave knew this. Michael knew this. They built the plan specifically to ensure Trevor didn't survive it, and then Trevor survived it anyway because Brad Snider stepped in front of the bullet that was meant for him. That is the central accident of GTA 5, not the heist going wrong, not the police arriving too fast, not the train hitting the getaway car. The central accident is that a man named Brad Snider moved at exactly the wrong moment and caught a bullet that changed the trajectory of every life in the story. Trevor lived. Brad died. And the plan that Dave had built so carefully and so pragmatically became something entirely different from what either man had agreed to. What it became was a cover-up inside a cover-up. Not just the fake death of Michael Townley, which would have been the manageable version, but the actual death of Brad Snider, the escaped survival of Trevor Phillips, and the need to construct a fiction that accounted for all of it simultaneously. Dave was good at constructing fictions. He had just found out how complicated they could get when reality started improvising around them. Ludendorff is the kind of town where nothing is supposed to happen. That's not a description of its character, it's a description of its utility. Small, flat, cold for 6 months of the year, defined by the kind of institutional quietness that settles over places where the main economic activity involves storage facilities and the police force is sized for the population rather than for contingencies. The Bobcat Security Cash Depot sat on Cavalry Boulevard and did not look like the kind of place anyone would bother with, which was precisely why 3 experienced bank robbers had selected it. December 2004. Christmas week, near enough that decorations were still visible in the windows of the businesses on the main strip. A tree in the foyer of the depot itself. The town was quiet in the way small towns go quiet in winter, not asleep but reduced, the population pulling inward toward warmth and obligations, the kind of day where a disturbance takes a little longer than usual to pull the right people out of the right buildings. Michael Townley, Trevor Phillips, and Brad Snider moved through the job with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the steps have stopped requiring deliberate thought. The heist became muscle memory somewhere along the way, somewhere in the prior years of jobs across multiple states, and on this particular morning in Ludendorff, the muscle memory was doing most of the work. They hit the facility in the early morning. The hostages, depot staff, a handful of contractors, were moved to a back room and secured. Trevor went to work on the vault with the explosive charge. Michael coordinated from near the entrance. When Trevor signaled clear, Michael placed the call that detonated the charge. The vault opened. They moved inside, worked through it quickly, came out with a bag containing just under $180,000 and turned toward the exit. That's where it stopped being routine. Jaspers, a Bobcat security guard who had survived the initial sweep of the building by being in the right back corridor at the right time, came around a corner at the exit door and got his hands on Michael before Michael saw him. It happened in the space of a second. A grab, a pull, a hand catching the edge of Michael's mask and dragging it sideways. Jaspers got a look at Michael's face. Not a complete one, not in ideal light, but enough. Michael, calm in the way that certain kinds of dangerous people are calm when there is no useful alternative to it, told Jaspers to walk, to take his night off, to go home and remember nothing. Jaspers did not move. Trevor shot him. That decision, which was Trevor's, made in the approximately 2 seconds between Jaspers standing his ground and the window for doing anything about it closing, cascaded immediately into every problem that followed. The North Yankton State Patrol had been building outside, alerted by a silent alarm or a call from a witness, or the general difficulty of keeping a vault explosion completely quiet in a small town. The shot was additional sound in an environment that was already producing too much of it. The converging response accelerated. The crew made it to the SUV. They made it to the Cavalry Boulevard Railroad crossing, a freight train running on the schedule that freight trains run on independent of whatever criminal activity is occurring at crossings along its route, came through the intersection and connected with the side of the SUV hard enough to spin the vehicle off the road and into a tree at a speed that put it well past drivable. 3 men on foot in the snow, with police coming from multiple directions and a helicopter pickup point still a running distance away. Dave Norton was in position. He had set himself up around a corner from the escape route, a sniper's placement, deliberate and prepared well before the job started. He had a clean line on the route the crew would take toward the pickup. He had a rifle, he had a blank cartridge loaded for the shot at Michael, and he had live ammunition for Trevor. He had been in this position long enough to be settled into it, past the point where the cold or the waiting created any physical discomfort that would affect the shot. He acquired Trevor. He fired. Brad Snider's body moved between the barrel and the target at exactly the wrong moment. The round hit Brad in the chest. Brad dropped. Dave's immediate assessment of the situation, conducted in the fractional second after the shot, was that the plan had collapsed in one of the specific ways he had not prepared a response for. Trevor was not down, Brad was down, Michael was still 20 feet away, and the job required Dave to fire the blank before the police processing of the scene made Michael's continued presence there impossible. He fired the blank. Michael went down convincingly, the bulletproof vest absorbing what the blank produced, the performance he had presumably rehearsed in his own mind executed cleanly, even as everything around it was coming apart. Trevor processed what his eyes gave him. Brad down, Michael down, police closing, no options that didn't involve running. He ran. He fought through the remaining North Yankton State Patrol with the specific violence that Trevor brings to every situation that requires it, briefly used a woman as a human shield to create a gap in the cordon, and disappeared into the North Yankton landscape before anyone organized a search parameter. He was gone. Dave was left at his position around the corner, listening to the police radio frequencies sort themselves out, watching from the edge of whatever concealment he'd set up, with a scene that looked approximately correct from a distance and was entirely wrong in its details. Brad Snider died from the chest wound. He was not supposed to die. He was supposed to be arrested, processed, and begin serving a sentence for his role in the Ludendorff job. His incarceration was a design feature of the plan. Brad, in federal custody, was Brad, who could be monitored and managed. Brad whose communications with the outside world could be intercepted and controlled, Brad who would eventually get out and know only what the system chose to tell him about what had happened to his crewmates. A dead Brad was none of those things. A dead Brad was a problem. The solution came fast and cold, the way solutions come when the alternative is exposure. Brad would be buried in Michael's place, Michael Townley's grave, the grave that needed to exist in Ludendorff Cemetery for the story to hold, the headstone that would close the official case and mark the end of a federal manhunt, would receive Brad Snider's body. Michael would have his new name and his new city. Dave would have his case closed. The headstone would say Michael Townley. The body inside it would never have been. The renegotiation between Dave and Michael in the immediate aftermath of the Ludendorff job is one of the most significant conversations in GTA 5 that the game never shows directly. What we know is that both men survived it and reached a workable conclusion. What we can infer is that the conversation was brief, conducted under pressure, and required both men to rapidly assess the new situation and agree on a response before the North Yankton State Patrol's processing of the scene created circumstances that were harder to manage. The core problem: Brad was dead. Brad was supposed to be arrested. With Brad dead, there was a body at the scene that would be identified and processed by North Yankton law enforcement, and that identification would create a record that Dave's official version of events would need to account for. Dave's official version of events needed to say that Michael Townley was dead. Brad Snider being identified at the scene as one of the dead would complicate that story, not fatally, but in ways that required management. If Brad's body was found at the scene under Brad Snider's identity, the case file would record Brad Snider as deceased at the Ludendorff job and Michael Townley as deceased at the Ludendorff job, with Trevor Phillips as the escaped third member. That was manageable in one sense: 2 dead, 1 escaped, case effectively closed. But it left Michael's grave empty of any body, which meant that Michael Townley's supposed burial would either require an exhumation-proof sealed coffin or a different body. The solution Dave constructed was the different body. Brad Snider would be processed through the scene as John Doe or as Michael Townley, or in whatever way Dave's control of the federal case file allowed him to shape the identification. Brad Snider's actual identity would be suppressed. Brad Snider's body would be moved or transferred or managed through the institutional access Dave had to the case documentation into the grave that was being prepared for Michael Townley. The headstone would say Michael Townley. The body would be Brad. The engineering of this is not fully explained in the game, and there are details of how exactly a federal agent manages the misidentification of a body at a multi-agency crime scene that require a level of institutional access and cooperation that GTA 5 leaves to implication. What matters is that it worked. The grave was prepared, the body was placed, the headstone was cut, and for 9 years nobody who walked past it in the Ludendorff Cemetery had reason to question what it contained. The misidentification of Brad Snider is, in some respects, the most technically demanding piece of the cover-up. Faking a death is one thing, filing a false report, adjusting a record, managing the narrative of a person who is going to disappear voluntarily. Misidentifying an actual body at an actual crime scene in a way that holds up to whatever forensic processing the North Yankton State Patrol applied to it is a different order of operation. It required Dave to reach into the institutional machinery of a crime scene he was theoretically present at only as the shooter who'd ended the Townley case, and to quietly redirect the identification of a body that was processed under circumstances where multiple law enforcement agencies had visibility. He managed it. That management, quiet, invisible, requiring no obvious action that anyone watching would have noticed, is the clearest demonstration of what Dave Norton's institutional access was actually worth. Not flashy intelligence work, not dramatic operational intervention. The ability to sit inside the administrative machinery of a federal investigation and adjust its outputs without touching its surface. Dave attended the funeral. In the enhanced version of the game, the remastered edition that came after the original PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 releases, Dave wears a ski hat at the graveside, the same hat he'd worn when he positioned himself with the sniper rifle on Cavalry Boulevard. Whether that continuity of costume is a deliberate callback, whether it's the game's enhanced detail system simply populating a consistent wardrobe, whether it's the specific kind of touch that Rockstar puts in its work when it wants a player who notices details to notice this one, it reads a certain way. The man who fired the shot that killed Brad Snider attended the ceremony in which Brad Snider's body was buried under another man's name, wearing the same hat. In the original release, Dave wore sunglasses at the funeral. That detail sits differently. The sunglasses of a man who doesn't want to be recognized at an event he has no sanctioned reason to attend, versus the ski hat of a man who perhaps needed the same head covering he'd worn in the cold that morning and didn't think about it, or perhaps chose it deliberately. Either way, Dave was there. He stood at a distance. He watched the ceremony for a man who was not dead, for a grave that held a man who had not been the intended target, for an operation that had produced approximately one of its 3 planned outcomes. Trevor was gone, Brad was dead, Michael was buried. Dave Norton's career had its win. He had no idea, standing at that graveside in Ludendorff, that he had also built the event that would define the next 9 years of his life, and very nearly end several of them, including his own. The letters started arriving not long after Ludendorff. They came addressed to Brad Snider at a federal correctional facility, because that was the story Trevor Phillips had been given. Brad shot and survived. Brad arrested at the scene. Brad in federal custody, serving time for his role in the job. Not dead, not buried under another man's name in a North Yankton cemetery, not laid out in the cold ground while the headstone above him said someone else entirely, just incarcerated, just away for a while. Trevor believed it. He needed to believe something, and this was the something available to him. Trevor had been at the scene. He had seen Brad go down. He had not seen Brad die, and in the chaos of the police response and his own escape, he had not stayed to confirm what going down meant for Brad specifically. When the story came to him, through whatever channel it came through, whatever rumor or FIB communication or piece of managed information Dave had arranged to surface in Trevor's direction, it fitted the facts he had directly observed. Brad had been hit. Brad had been arrested. Brad was alive. The first letter came from a Sandy Shores return address. Trevor had made his way to Blaine County after escaping North Yankton, far from Ludendorff, far from Los Santos, far from wherever Michael had gone. He settled in Sandy Shores, which was the specific kind of place that suited Trevor's particular needs, remote enough to operate without sustained scrutiny, connected enough to run the kind of business Trevor was interested in building, rough enough that Trevor's native register didn't require translation or moderation for the local social context. He wrote to Brad, asked how he was, said whatever Trevor Phillips says when he's writing to someone he considers, in his own terms, a friend. Dave Norton received that letter. More precisely, a letter addressed to a federal inmate who did not exist at a facility that was holding no one named Brad Snider, arrived at whatever contact point Dave had established for Brad's fictional incarceration. Because Brad Snider was in the ground in Ludendorff, because Brad Snider would never be at any federal facility, because Brad Snider was dead. Any correspondence sent to Brad in prison arrived by design, with Dave. He saw the Sandy Shores postmark. He understood immediately who had sent it, and what Trevor being in Sandy Shores and writing letters to a dead man meant for the stability of the arrangement he was sitting inside of. Dave made the decision that would consume more of his professional attention over the next 9 years than anything else he did. He wrote back. The GTA wiki drawing on in-game sources, describes the correspondence as managed through FIB trainees under Dave's direction. Not Dave alone, sitting at a desk in Los Santos and composing letters as Brad Snider, a system, FIB personnel, presumably selected for discretion and operating without full knowledge of what they were sustaining, working from Dave's direction and Dave's knowledge of what the letters needed to contain. The responses were careful. They were calibrated to carry Brad's emotional register without being so specific that they'd require knowledge Dave didn't have about Brad's inner life. They struck a tone somewhere between resignation and a kind of peace, as though Brad had arrived at some accommodation with his situation, as though the years in federal custody had given him time to process what happened in Ludendorff and to reach a place of something like acceptance. I hope you are staying out of trouble, either that or give yourself up. That line, drawn from the Brad correspondence and surfacing in the game, is so precisely measured that it almost reads as an accident. It's advice, friendly, mildly wry advice from a man in prison to a man still out in the world. It's also, understood in its actual function, a management tool. Dave needed Trevor to stay in Sandy Shores, stay operational in the narrow band of activity that kept him occupied and away from questions, stay connected to the idea of Brad as a future rather than Brad as a loss. Give yourself up is not serious. It's the kind of thing you say to someone you're trying to keep in a particular emotional position, the position of a person who still has a friend, who is still waiting for something, who is not yet ready to start examining the shape of what they're waiting for. There were other letters. Brad mentioned the possibility of visitors when the rules permitted. Brad described the facility in enough non-specific detail to feel real without risking contradiction from anyone who knew what federal facilities actually looked like. Brad expressed interest in what Trevor was doing, in how things were going with the business, in whether Trevor was taking care of himself in the various ways that Trevor was constitutionally unsuited to taking care of himself. 9 years. Hold that number in mind. Not a temporary measure, not a bridging solution while something more permanent was arranged. 9 years of active, sustained fictional correspondence. 9 years of Trevor Phillips composing letters and receiving what he believed were responses. 9 years of someone in the FIB infrastructure reading Trevor's actual thoughts, Trevor's actual words, and producing replies designed to keep those thoughts moving in a particular direction and away from the only question that would have broken the fiction immediately. The question, if Brad is in prison, why has no one I know been able to visit him? The question, if Brad is in prison, why are his responses so non-specific about the facility, the other inmates, the daily texture of where he is? The question, above all others, who is actually in that grave in Ludendorff with Michael Townley's name on it? Trevor did not ask these questions for 9 years, and that is not because Trevor is not intelligent or observant. It is because Dave managed the correspondence carefully enough that Trevor never had reason to formulate them as questions rather than as gaps he hadn't thought to fill. There's something worth sitting with in what that cost Trevor emotionally. He was not grieving Brad because he didn't know Brad was dead. He was not in denial about Brad because he had ongoing evidence of Brad's continued existence. He was in the stranger and perhaps worse state of a person who believes their friend is away for a long time, away in difficult circumstances, but coming back eventually, present in the form of letters, accessible in a limited and frustrating way, but not gone. That kind of waiting has its own weight. The specific weight of a relationship suspended in the future, tense. The years passing while the friend is still theoretically there, still corresponding, still alive, in the sense that letters arrive and replies go out and the connection persists, even if it's been reduced to paper. Trevor carried that for 9 years. Dave read his letters for 9 years. Brad Snider's grave sat in Ludendorff with Michael Townley's name on the stone, and the body inside it was not disturbed, and the secret held because the one person who would have acted on it immediately was busy corresponding with a dead man and had not yet thought to ask why the dead man's handwriting had changed so much since the last time he'd seen it on a note. There's a specific kind of cruelty in the correspondence, and it's worth examining directly rather than allowing it to remain implicit. Trevor Phillips was writing letters in the genuine belief that he was maintaining a connection with a living friend, not performing connection for someone else's benefit, not going through the motions of a relationship he'd already processed as lost. He was writing to Brad because Brad was, as far as Trevor understood it, alive and imprisoned and reachable by letter in a way that he wasn't reachable in person. The letters were real. The feelings inside them were real. And on the other end of the correspondence, a federal agent or a series of federal trainees directed by a federal agent was reading those feelings and constructing responses calculated to keep Trevor at a manageable emotional distance from the truth. The specific violation in that is not just the deception. Deception about a friend's death is serious enough on its own. The violation is the appropriation of Trevor's grief, his unresolved, misdirected, endlessly sustained grief for a person he didn't know he was grieving as a management tool. Dave took the thing that Trevor was most vulnerable about and turned it into an instrument of ongoing control. Every time Trevor wrote a letter, he was extending the period of his own misunderstanding. Every time he received a reply, he was being actively guided away from the knowledge he needed. His genuine emotional attachment to Brad was the mechanism Dave used to keep him pointing in the wrong direction. That is a different order of wrong from simply lying about what happened. It is the specific wrong of using someone's love as a lock, and it ran for 9 years. The question of what the letters actually contained is one the game only partially answers. We get fragments, the line about staying out of trouble, the references to potential future visits, the general tone of cautious optimism from a man apparently making peace with his circumstances. But the full content of 9 years of correspondence is not available for examination. What we can infer is that the responses were good enough. They fooled someone who was intelligent and suspicious, and who had direct personal knowledge of Brad Snider as a person. They fooled him for 9 years. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen through carelessness. Someone, Dave, or the trainees working under his direction, put genuine effort into constructing a fake Brad that Trevor would believe. That effort, sustained over 9 years, is its own strange thing to contemplate. The institutional resources deployed, the reading of incoming letters, the composition of outgoing ones, the maintenance of a voice and a persona across a decade, not for a strategic objective that required an active intelligence target, not for a case that was generating new information or moving toward a resolution, just to keep one man in Blaine County from asking the question that would unravel a single federal agent's career. Dave spent 9 years of institutional resources keeping Trevor Phillips in the dark. And in the end, it wasn't the correspondence that failed. The correspondence was intact. Trevor had no specific reason to disbelieve it in the sense of having found a concrete error or contradiction in the letters. What failed was everything else. Michael coming back into Trevor's orbit, Michael's specific evasiveness around Brad, the accumulated weight of 9 years of answered letters that had somehow never translated into a single visit or a phone call or any form of contact other than paper. Trevor arrived at the truth through instinct, not evidence, and when he acted on the instinct, when he went to Ludendorff and dug, he found the evidence waiting for him. 9 years is a specific duration when you place it against the events it spanned. In 9 years, Trevor Phillips built a criminal enterprise in Blaine County from a one-man operation running meth out of a trailer into a multi-territory business with personnel, supply chains, and enough operational volume that multiple outside organizations were interested in buying into it or taking it over. He established relationships, made enemies, fought wars over territory, and survived circumstances that killed everyone around him on at least 3 separate occasions. Trevor became, in those 9 years, a specific kind of institution in Blaine County, recognizable, feared, embedded in the landscape in the way that certain dangerous things become embedded in the landscapes they occupy. He did all of that while writing letters to a dead man. In 9 years, Michael DeSanta lived in Rockford Hills, paid his therapy bills, watched his children grow into people he didn't fully recognize, had arguments with his wife that covered everything except the central thing, and sent Dave Norton a check every month. He discovered that domestic life in a Rockford Hills mansion was its own specific kind of confinement. He discovered that the exit he'd chosen from one kind of prison had placed him inside a more comfortable but equally binding version of the same institution. He became, in those 9 years, the specific kind of person that circumstances produce when someone with a particular set of capabilities is denied all opportunity to use them. He did all of that while Dave Norton managed his continued existence from a safe distance, and Dave, in those same 9 years, built a life in Los Santos on the foundation of both situations. The payments from Michael supplemented a federal salary into something comfortable. The career credibility from the Townley case provided a professional position that didn't require further major results to maintain. The one result was doing the job of several, the way significant results in institutional careers often do. Dave worked under Haines, managed his correspondence with Trevor, received his payments from Michael, and lived the life of a man who had made one major transaction and was still receiving its dividends a decade later. 3 lives, running in parallel, interconnected by a series of events that happened in 30 seconds in North Yankton in December 2004, each one dependent on the others maintaining their current state, each one a pressure point that, if disturbed, would disturb all the others. Dave's job, across those 9 years, was to make sure none of the pressure points were disturbed. He was very good at it. And then, in 2013, he wasn't, because the factors that broke the arrangement were not ones he had access to control. In Sandy Shores, Trevor built his business. He ran the operations that would eventually become the Trevor Phillips Industries enterprise, meth manufacturing, arms distribution, the kind of Blaine County territorial enterprise that kept him occupied and kept him embedded in the specific geography that Dave's correspondence was tracking. He wrote his letters. He received his answers. He waited for a visit that was never going to happen because the person he was waiting to visit did not exist at any correctional facility in the state. In Rockford Hills, Michael DeSanta paid his rate. In whatever office or arrangement Dave had established, the checks arrived and the letters were processed, and the fiction was maintained, and the grave in Ludendorff sat undisturbed in the North Yankton ground for 9 years. The mansion in Rockford Hills was nice. That's the right word for it. Not grand, not opulent, not the kind of property that announces itself to people passing on the street. Nice. Tastefully expensive, the kind of house that signals success without specifying what kind. Multiple floors, a pool visible from the garden level, a garage with vehicles Michael barely drove, a neighborhood that had the specific quality of places where people with significant money move to avoid being asked about it. Michael DeSanta moved in. Amanda moved in. Jimmy and Tracy, young enough to absorb the transition into a new name and a new city without the specific kind of damage it would have caused slightly later, grew up there, and every month a 5-figure payment left Michael's account and arrived wherever Dave Norton had arranged to receive it. This is the quiet machinery of the cover-up at its most domestic. a well-decorated suburban property in a wealthy part of Los Santos, maintained on a combination of criminal earnings from the prior years and whatever financial structure Michael had built around his new identity, with an invisible monthly obligation to an FIB agent 3 time zones away as the rent on a life that technically belonged to a dead man. Dave and Michael stayed in contact across those 9 years, not visibly, not in any way that produced a record or created a pattern observable to anyone paying attention to either of them, but the arrangement required maintenance. Both men needed to know that the other was where he was supposed to be. Dave had to know that Michael wasn't going back to work, wasn't drawing attention, wasn't doing anything that would surface the Townley case on someone's desk in a way that required examination. Michael had to know that Dave was keeping the Ludendorff file closed, that no one was coming back to look at the outcomes of the case, that the monthly payments were being received quietly rather than in a way that generated financial investigation. There was a mutual monitoring quality to their relationship, 2 men checking on each other at intervals, from a distance, through whatever off-the-books communication they'd established, making sure neither one was about to make a move that would force the other's hand. Dave was not a presence in Michael's daily life. He was more like a standing debt, an obligation that renewed monthly and surfaced occasionally in the form of a reminder to maintain the terms. A padlock, present and functional without needing to be examined constantly until the moment the lock became relevant because something was trying to open the door. Michael, for his part, was not flourishing in any sense that the word conventionally implies. The marriage was in a specific kind of slow collapse. Amanda's affairs were not secrets, not by the time the game begins, not by the time anyone in the De Santa household had been living in the house long enough to understand the patterns. The specific texture of Michael's domestic situation, a wife he had failed in ways that predated the current circumstances, children who were growing into people he didn't quite recognize, a house that was well maintained and deeply uncomfortable to be in, is something GTA 5 depicts with more care than most games bother to. Michael argues with Amanda constantly, argues with Jimmy constantly, watches Tracy from a careful distance and channels whatever he can't contain into sessions with Dr. Isaiah Friedlander, a therapist he visits with the regularity and the specific desperation of a man who needs to talk to someone about problems he cannot describe in their actual terms because the actual terms would expose crimes that would end his current existence. The therapy sessions cost money. Everything cost money. Amanda's spending had moved through significant portions of what Michael had saved over the years of active work, and the lifestyle required by Rockford Hills, the house, the vehicles, the school, the general maintenance of an identity built on visible prosperity required ongoing expenditure that the monthly payments from Dave helped sustain in the other direction. The payments went out. The bills came in, the pool was maintained, the family continued living in a house where the primary emotional atmosphere was the specific low-grade tension of people who know something is wrong and have agreed, without discussing it, not to name it. The children are worth spending a moment on because they represent the most direct cost of the 2004 arrangement in human terms, people who paid for something they had no knowledge of and no say in. Jimmy De Santa grew up with a father who was emotionally absent in the specific way of men carrying secrets they cannot share. Not physically absent, Michael was around the house, present in the way that suburban fathers of his generation were present, available for the arguments and the meals and the occasional moment of genuine connection, but emotionally foreclosed in the way that people are emotionally foreclosed when a significant portion of their interior life cannot be named out loud in the presence of the people they're closest to. Jimmy picked up on this absence without being able to name it. His response to it, the schemes, the extortion, the performative hostility, is the response of a teenager who is trying to get a reaction from a person who has learned to keep his most important reactions private. Tracy was older and in some ways more observant, which made her avoidance of the underlying problem more deliberate. She chased celebrity in the specific Los Santos way, the reality television, the connection-seeking, the constant outward projection of someone who has determined that visibility is the solution to a problem whose name she can't quite access. The problem, in the version of it that lives inside the DeSanta house, is that her father is not who he appears to be and can never explain why. That explanation is not something Michael can give her, so she goes looking for the answer in the places Los Santos offers, which are the wrong places, but they're the available ones. Both children would have been living entirely different lives if Michael Townley had been arrested in 2004 rather than given the exit Dave Norton arranged for him. That's not a judgment about whether the different lives would have been better or worse. It's just the observable fact that everything about Jimmy and Tracy DeSanta, the house, the school, the neighborhood, the father they grew up with, traces back to one private deal made in the dark between a bank robber and a federal agent. Dave Norton paid for that arrangement in monthly installments. The children paid for it in every interaction they had with a father who could never be fully present in the life they were sharing. Michael was bored. That is the simple version of something more complicated, but it contains the essential element. He had been a man who planned operations, who read rooms full of armed strangers and made correct assessments, who moved under pressure with the specific clarity that certain kinds of work produces in certain kinds of people. He had swapped that life for one in which the primary challenges were managing his son's financial schemes, dealing with his wife's friends, and navigating the social landscape of a neighborhood that accepted him because he could afford to live there and did not examine his history because it was not the neighborhood's habit to examine histories. He went to Friedlander's office. He came home. He ate too much. He didn't exercise. He watched the pool. Dr. Isaiah Friedlander is worth a paragraph because what Michael was doing in that therapy office and why is one of the more specifically observed pieces of GTA 5's character work. Friedlander is a bad therapist. Not in the clinical sense necessarily, but in the human sense. He's distracted, self-absorbed, more interested in his own projects and celebrity aspirations than in the people sitting across from him. He nods at the right moments. He asks the right follow-up questions. He produces the surface texture of therapeutic engagement without the substance underneath it. And Michael keeps going back every week because the alternative to a bad therapist is no therapist, and Michael DeSanta needs somewhere to put the things he cannot discuss anywhere else. What Michael cannot discuss anywhere else, that his name is not his name, that the house he lives in was paid for partly with stolen money and partly with the proceeds of 9 years of payments from a fund that exists because a federal agent agreed not to report his death, that his children are growing up in a life built on a federal fraud, that somewhere in North Yankton there is a grave with his name on it and someone else's body in it, that the man he thinks might be his closest friend doesn't know he's alive. None of that can go in the therapy notes. So what goes in the therapy notes is the rest of it, the marriage, the children, the boredom, the specific misery of a man who has everything he thought he wanted and cannot identify why it doesn't feel like enough. Friedlander treats these as the primary issues. They are real issues. They are simply not the only issues or even the most important ones, and treating them in isolation from the context they sit inside is like treating a fever without examining what's causing it. Michael paid for this every week for years, and Friedlander would later sell Michael's session transcripts to an undisclosed buyer, which is perhaps the most perfectly calibrated betrayal in a game full of them. The one person Michael was partially honest with, turning that partial honesty into a commercial transaction. The retirement was the sentence, not the house, not the family, not the name, the retirement itself, the prohibition on going back to the work that had given his life its particular shape. The deal with Dave had purchased Michael's freedom at the cost of the one thing Michael actually knew how to do, and 9 years later that cost was visible in the texture of every conversation Michael had with everyone in his life. He was miserable in a way that had no clean exit, because the clean exit was the thing he'd already taken, and it had turned out to be its own cage. Then Michael met Franklin Clinton. It started with a car. Franklin was working debt recovery for a dealership that had financed Jimmy DeSanta's car purchase, a purchase Jimmy had no realistic intention or ability to pay for. Franklin came to repossess the vehicle. Michael was in it. What followed, a high-speed run through a dealership fence, a vehicle destroyed, the specific electricity that Michael had been missing without knowing he was missing it, became the entry point for everything that followed. The Vangelico jewelry store robbery was the second act. Michael planned it, organized it through Lester Crest, executed it with Franklin as the primary operator on the floor. It went cleanly, with millions in jewelry leaving the Rockford Hills store in a methodical and well-prepared operation, clean enough that anyone who'd studied Michael Townley's methodology would have recognized the signature immediately. Someone did. Steve Haines had been with the FIB since 1993. In the 20 years between his entry to the Bureau and the events of GTA-5's 2013 timeline, he had managed to decorate himself thoroughly, accumulate a unit of his own, and construct a professional persona that functioned on two levels simultaneously. Publicly, the dedicated federal agent committed to dismantling organized crime in the Los Santos metropolitan area. Privately, a man whose connections to Devin Weston and whose ongoing use of unauthorized operations were extensive enough that if any of it surfaced in the right investigation, he was looking at a federal prison sentence longer than his remaining career. Haines also hosted a television program. The Underbelly of Paradise had been on the air since 2008, with Haines presenting himself to the Los Santos viewing public as the authoritative voice on street-level criminality, the decorated FIB man who'd seen the worst of it and came back every week to report on it calmly and knowledgeably. The show was legitimate in the way that certain tools of corrupt people are legitimate. It did the thing it claimed to do, and it also did something else. It gave Haines visibility, a public face, a platform that created separation between the version of Steve Haines that was on camera and the version that was ordering unauthorized operations and taking money from a billionaire with no obvious interest in federal law being applied to his activities. By 2013, Haines was managing Dave Norton as a subordinate within his unit. Dave was the man below Haines whose record he could examine and whose vulnerabilities he understood from institutional proximity. Their relationship was not that of equals, and it had never been framed as though it were. Haines ran the unit. Dave operated within it. Haines knew things about Dave's record, about the kinds of cases Dave had worked, about the outcomes those cases had produced, about the specific gaps and ambiguities that showed up when you looked at the Townley file carefully enough. When the Vangelico robbery came across his desk, Haines looked at it carefully enough. The methodology was recognizable, a specific combination of preparation, misdirection, and operational precision that had a profile in federal records from the years when Michael Townley was active: tear gas deployment, multi-exit coordination, a frequency hack on police communications that required advanced technical work. These were not the characteristics of Los Santos street-level criminality. They were the characteristics of someone who had spent years executing exactly this kind of work. Haines pulled Dave Norton's case file. He found the arrangement, the fake death, the relocation, Michael Townley alive in Los Santos under the name DeSanta, sending Dave Norton a monthly payment in exchange for the maintenance of his official death certificate and the ongoing closure of his federal case. 9 years of this. The case closed. The payments sustained. the man who was supposed to be buried in Ludendorff, living in Rockford Hills. Haines was not outraged by this. Outrage is what you feel when something violates your principles, and Haines was not a man with principles that this particular discovery violated. What he felt was something considerably more practical, the specific alertness of a person who has just found leverage he did not previously know he had. A corrupt federal agent who discovers leverage over another corrupt federal agent does not report it. He uses it. The bureaucratic logic is simple and complete. If Haines exposes Dave, Haines loses a subordinate, creates an internal investigation, draws attention to his unit at a moment when his unit cannot sustain attention, and gains nothing. If Haines uses Dave's situation to bring Dave's asset, Michael DeSanta, and through him Franklin Clinton and Trevor Phillips, into service as unpaid FIB operatives for Haines' ongoing campaign against the IAA, Haines gains 3 highly capable criminal operatives and loses nothing except the option he could have taken but didn't. The creation of the underbelly of paradise in 2008 was not incidental to Haines's corruption, it was structural to it. A television program that positions you as the public authority on criminal activity is not just a career supplement, it's a specific kind of protection. When Steve Haines reports on Los Santos gang violence, when he sits across from a camera and explains the mechanics of street-level crime in the measured tones of a man who has spent his career studying it, he is creating a public record of himself as the adversary of the people he's actually working alongside in another part of his life. The show is an alibi, not for any specific crime, but for the general accusation. Who would believe that the man who went on television every week to discuss the threat of organized crime was himself running unauthorized operations for a billionaire? That's the specific logic of Haines' public persona. It's not vanity, exactly, though Haines is clearly not immune to the pleasures of television prominence. It's defense, architected through visibility. Dave Norton had no equivalent defense. Dave didn't have a public face. Dave didn't have a platform that generated public goodwill. Dave had his case file, the monthly payments, and whatever goodwill Haines's position provided him by proximity. When Haines' position started collapsing under the weight of the FIB's internal investigation, Dave had nothing to fall back on except usefulness. His ability to remain the person in the room who knew more than anyone else about the thing that needed to be managed. That asymmetry, Haines with the platform, Dave with only the operational knowledge, is the specific power dynamic that made Haines' blackmail of Dave so clean. Haines had leverage on Dave from 2 directions, from above through institutional seniority, and from outside through the public persona that would make any accusation against Haines feel, at first, counterintuitive to the general public. Dave had leverage on Haines from only one direction, knowledge. And knowledge is only leverage as long as the person who has it remains in a position where knowledge matters. Dave remained in that position by being useful, consistently, right up until Haines died and the position question resolved itself. He chose the asset. He went to Dave with the information and the demand. Deliver Michael, deliver the crew. All of them would work for Haines. All of them would execute whatever operations Haines needed executed, without pay, without official record, without any mechanism by which they could later claim to have been operating under authorized instruction. Dave's options were the options of a man who has no good options. He could refuse. He could let Haines take the information to the right people and watch the Townley case get reopened, the fake death unraveled, the 9 years of monthly payments become evidence of ongoing federal corruption. Whatever sentence that produced would be significant. The cover-up alone was federal material, the fraudulent case files, the manufactured death certificate, the sustained deception of a federal investigation. These were not minor charges. Or he could comply. He could go to Michael DeSanta's residence for the first time since the arrangement began, explain that the situation had changed, and bring Michael and his associates into Haines' operation. Dave complied. He went to the DeSanta house. It was the first time he had been there, the first time he had been physically present in Michael's Los Santos life, in the house and the neighborhood that the monthly payments had helped sustain. He found Michael, the man he'd been managing from a careful distance since 2004, looking like someone who had been living inside an expensive discomfort for 9 years and had arrived at a state of very specific resignation about it. Dave's warning was direct and complete. The Vangelico job had broken Michael's careful anonymity. The methodology had been recognizable, and the wrong person had recognized it. Haines knew, and Haines was going to use what he knew. Michael needed to understand that the deal he'd been operating under since 2004 had been superseded by a new arrangement that Michael did not have the option of declining. He also told Michael about Trevor. This was the more surprising piece of the conversation from Michael's perspective. Michael had spent 9 years believing Trevor was dead, not as an assumption he'd made without basis, but as a conclusion he'd reached from 9 years of silence. Trevor had disappeared after Ludendorff and had not, as far as Michael could determine, made contact with him or surfaced anywhere in his life. Michael interpreted that silence as the absence of a living person rather than the silence of a living person who believed Michael was dead. Dave knew differently. 9 years of reading Trevor's letters had given Dave a precise picture of Trevor's location, Trevor's activities, and Trevor's current state of mind. He knew Trevor was in Sandy Shores. He knew Trevor was running a Blaine County operation. He knew Trevor had been writing to Brad consistently and believed Brad to be alive and imprisoned. He told Michael where Trevor was. Michael found this extremely difficult to process and was still processing it when, a relatively short time after Dave's visit, Trevor Phillips appeared at the DeSanta residence front door. Trevor had seen the Vangelico news coverage and recognized what he was looking at. He had sent Wade to find a man matching Michael's description in Los Santos. Wade had done his job. Trevor had driven down from Sandy Shores to Rockford Hills and was now standing in Michael's doorway. The two men who had not seen each other since December 2004 were in the same house. Dave Norton's most dangerous variable had just become a Rockford Hills problem, and Haines, watching this from his FIB position, now had all 3 of the assets he needed. The question was what he was going to do with them. Understanding Dave Norton's function in the 2013 section of GTA 5 requires stepping back from the individual missions long enough to see the structure they fit inside. Haines built a machine. The machine had a purpose: to drain resources from the IAA, Haines' rival agency, by any means available, while simultaneously expanding FIB funding and Haines' own institutional position. The operations Haines ordered, the Ferdinand Kerimov extraction, the Humane Labs chemical facility raid, the destruction of the IAA's nerve toxin program, all served that purpose. They were unauthorized, unpaid, conducted through deniable assets, and calibrated to damage a competing federal agency while leaving no direct line back to Haines himself. Dave Norton's job inside this machine was translator, not planner, not architect, not even the primary decision-maker on any of the operations he was visibly involved in. Dave was the human interface between Haines' demands and the 3 people being compelled to fulfill them. He spoke both languages. He could take Haines' instructions and render them in terms that Michael, Franklin, and Trevor could follow without immediately refusing. He could take the reality of working with 3 experienced and volatile criminals and communicate it back up the chain in ways that kept Haines from making demands that would produce refusals. He was the buffer, the diplomatic layer, the voice of something resembling pragmatism in a structure that was moving steadily away from it. He was also, by his own cheerful self-assessment, only minimally corrupt. That line, corruption? Just a little, definitely below average, arrives in a moment when Michael is pressing Dave about the nature of the federal corruption they're both navigating, and Dave's response is not defensive. It's almost relaxed. He's measured himself against the standard of the people around him, found himself favorably positioned on the spectrum, and arrived at a comfortable, if entirely provisional, peace with the finding. Compared to Haines, Dave is practically ethical. Compared to Devin Weston, Dave is practically ethical. Compared to the IAA leadership, who are running a nerve toxin program for a staged domestic terrorist attack, Dave is practically ethical. The corruption is real, but it's contextual, and the context is so aggressively corrupt that a man receiving monthly kickbacks from a fake dead criminal while covering up an accidental killing genuinely registers as somewhere below average on the available scale. Dave knew this about himself. It didn't comfort him exactly, but it provided a way of looking at things. The period between Dead Man Walking and the Kortz Center, the sustained operational sequence that Dave managed as the interface between Haines and the three protagonists, produced something in Dave's bearing that the game captures without making explicit. He became, across those months, incrementally more tired, not physically, not in the way that missions produce physical exhaustion that players see in character animations. Tired in the specific way of a person who has been running a complex deception for 9 years, then been pulled back into active service under a man who uses more resources more recklessly than Dave would have chosen, then been asked to participate directly in a Blaine County bank robbery and a chemical weapons facility raid, and who can see, with the clarity of someone who has spent 2 decades in institutional environments, that the structure they're operating inside is not stable. Haines was not stable. That was the assessment Dave was living with through every operation. Not incompetent. Haines was genuinely capable in specific ways, and his instincts about leverage and pressure were often accurate. But Haines was operating under the specific kind of institutional pressure that makes people make decisions that prioritize short-term self-preservation over long-term structural stability. He was scared of the internal investigation, scared of what Sanchez might be doing, scared of the IAA's capacity to flip the narrative on the unauthorized operations, and scared people in positions of authority have a consistent behavioral pattern. They accelerate, they try to resolve things faster, which means they cut more corners, which means the thing they're trying to resolve becomes more unstable rather than less. Dave could see this. He was managing it, trying to slow it, trying to be the voice in the room that argued for the more careful approach when the more careful approach was still available. He didn't always succeed. The bank robbery at Blaine County was the most visible failure, a situation where Haines' refusal to properly plan for crew meant that Dave himself ended up inside the robbery rather than managing it from a distance. But Dave kept trying. That is the consistent quality in Dave Norton's approach to every situation he found himself in during 2013. He kept trying to be the most rational person in a sequence of increasingly irrational events. He didn't always manage it, but he didn't stop trying either, right up until the Kortz Center made stopping irrelevant. The Dead Man Walking mission was the first formal operational contact between Dave and Michael under the new arrangement. Dave arranged the meeting at the Galileo Observatory, a specific choice of venue that reflected Dave's instinct for operational presentation. The observatory is visible from a distance, which means no one can approach unseen. It's a tourist landmark, which means 2 men talking there don't need a cover story. It's far enough from the DeSanta residence that anyone surveilling Michael's home wouldn't automatically connect his presence there to a FIB contact. Dave had chosen the location with the same pragmatism he brought to everything else. When Michael arrived, Dave laid it out directly. The Vangelico job, the attention it had drawn, the fact that Michael's return to active work had created exactly the kind of profile the 2004 arrangement was specifically designed to prevent him from creating. Michael, characteristically, responded to this by spreading his hands and inviting Dave to arrest him, as if daring Dave to convert their private arrangement into something official. knowing that doing so would expose the arrangement itself. Dave declined the dare, as both men knew he would. He had a request instead. Ferdinand Kerimov was the IAA's key informant on domestic terrorism operations. The IAA had declared him dead. The FIB believed he was alive, being debriefed at an IAA-controlled location. If Kerimov was alive and the information he held reached the wrong people, it would damage Haines' position significantly. Dave needed confirmation. Was the body in the Strawberry IAA morgue actually Kerimov, or was it a placeholder while the real Kerimov was somewhere else? He needed someone inside the morgue to check. Michael asked the reasonable follow-up question about how exactly he was supposed to get into a federal morgue. Dave Norton, who had been building up to this, knocked Michael unconscious with a truncheon as Michael was losing consciousness. "You've played dead before. The line has a specific weight. It's true in both directions. Michael played dead in 2004 at Dave's direction, and now Dave is using that precedent to send him into a morgue as a pretend corpse. It acknowledges what they are to each other without sentimentalizing it. It's the kind of thing a man says when he's been carrying a complicated arrangement for 9 years and has arrived at the point where the absurdity of it is simply part of the operating environment. Dave isn't delighted by the cleverness of the line. He's just saying the true thing." Michael woke up in an IAA morgue, confirmed the body on the Kerimov slab was not Kerimov by any recognizable metric, called Dave, was told to get out immediately, and proceeded to shoot his way through approximately 14 IAA agents to recover his weapons from the evidence room on the top floor. The escape involved a window, a dumpster, a 3-star wanted level, and a phone call to Franklin warning him that FIB involvement in their lives was no longer hypothetical. Dave emailed Michael afterward. He acknowledged the chaos generated by the morgue extraction. He told Michael to stop coming out of retirement when he'd been explicitly asked not to, and he laid out the new terms. "I will do my best to protect you as a valued friend of my firm, but you're going to have to play ball." That phrase, "valued friend of my firm," it's exactly the register Dave operates in when he needs to communicate something important in language that won't be misread, warm enough to acknowledge the real relationship. 9 years of mutual dependency is a relationship regardless of its foundation, formal enough to make clear that the warmth has limits and conditions. My firm is the tell, not the FIB, not the Bureau, not law enforcement. His firm, the private operation he and Haines are running inside the institutional shell of a federal agency. Three's company forced Trevor into the fold directly. The mid-air extraction of Kerimov from the IAA's Los Santos headquarters, Michael rappelling from a helicopter onto the roof, Trevor providing airborne cover, Franklin evading the IAA ground response, was the first operation that put all three of them working in close coordination for Haines' benefit. In the FIB Buffalo afterward, with Dave driving, his radio preference surfaced without commentary. Los Santos rock radio, playing through the car speakers as Dave and Michael moved through traffic. It's a small moment. In the context of everything around it, it reads as the closest thing to a genuine personality detail that the game gives Dave. A radio station, casually chosen, revealing nothing except that he has preferences like anyone else, and Los Santos rock radio is one of them. By the book is where Dave disclosed something he had been keeping between himself and Michael. The Brad correspondence. He told Michael, during a conversation between missions, that he had been the one composing the responses to Trevor's letters for 9 years, that the Brad Trevor believed he was in contact with was Dave's construction, that the correspondence Trevor had been treating as evidence of a living friend was managed fiction. What Michael said in response to this information is left to inference. The game doesn't give his exact words. What the game gives is the fact that after By the Book, Michael is operating with explicit knowledge that Dave spent 9 years systematically deceiving Trevor about the death of their shared friend and is doing so in partnership with Dave within a week of learning it. The Blaine County Savings Bank robbery is a different kind of moment. Haines had organized the operational sequence leading toward the Humane Labs nerve toxin raid, and when the team assembled at the staging area, Haines realized that nobody had arranged additional crew. He attributed this to Dave. Dave attributed it to Sanchez. In the absence of resolution and with an operation on the clock, Haines and Dave themselves participated directly in a Blaine County bank robbery to generate the cash flow needed for the Humane Labs operation. An FIB deputy director, a mid-level FIB agent, robbing a bank in Palito Bay. The sequence of events that produces that sentence is not one that would have been predicted by anyone who understood, at the beginning of this story, what kind of person Dave Norton was, the unremarkable agent from the Midwest who built his career on one carefully structured deception, ended up robbing a bank in Blaine County in active partnership with a man he was officially supposed to have killed in 2004. Dave made the bank raid work. He did it without visible complaint. He emerged from the bank under fire, boarded a military truck that Trevor had appropriated, and moved through a sustained North Yankton State Patrol pursuit toward the objective. Whatever he felt about this specific sequence of events is not something Dave shared with anyone who recorded it. The Humane Labs raid secured the nerve toxin. Haines dealt with his own exposure by shooting himself in the left leg at the perimeter and presenting himself as a double agent who had been attempting to stop the theft from inside. He was later shot in the same leg at the Kortz Center. Whether Rockstar intended that symmetry as commentary is a question for the people who wrote it. The FIB headquarters infiltration, Michael and Franklin going into the Rockefeller Drive building to physically destroy the files documenting Haines's and Dave's unauthorized operations, was supposed to be the last job. Dave had framed it as the terminal obligation. Do this, and the arrangement ends. Michael completed it and called the marker in. Dave declined to honor it. He had learned of the Merriweather attacks Trevor had been conducting, which gave him enough pretext to demand one final meeting. The Kortz Center, and at the Kortz Center, everything Dave had been carefully maintaining for the better part of 2 years exploded simultaneously. The Kortz Center sits at the top of the Pacific Bluffs, a museum complex built on the cliffs above the ocean. On a clear morning, it's a specific kind of beautiful. The water visible below the edge, the city visible further east, the pavilions and outdoor exhibit spaces built to take advantage of a view that most Los Santos venues would not have wasted on cultural programming. It is not a place you'd choose for a sensitive meeting between a federal agent and a man whose death he had faked a decade earlier. But Dave was no longer choosing venues based on suitability. He was choosing based on what was available while Haines was watching his movements, and what was available on that particular morning was a cliff-top museum complex with enough open space that approaching danger would be visible from a distance. Andreas Sanchez is worth a brief profile because his position in the story, the double agent who was shot by his own superior when he was revealed, is the one that most directly parallels Dave's, and the contrast is instructive. Sanchez had been operating as a double agent for the rival FIB team for some period prior to the Kortz Center confrontation. He was, in institutional terms, doing something very similar to what Dave was doing, operating inside a corrupt structure while simultaneously serving the interests of a different party, keeping the dual role sustainable through the kind of careful management that such roles require, and trusting that the institution's chaos would provide enough cover that the contradiction wouldn't be examined too closely. The difference is that Sanchez revealed himself at the Kortz Center. Either he chose to, or he was forced to, or the rival FIB team's arrival made concealment no longer viable. He named his allegiance in a room full of people, at least one of whom was going to survive the immediate aftermath and construct a narrative around it. Haines shot him. Dave chose not to reveal himself at the Kortz Center. He chose to stay inside his existing position, damaged, compromised, under pressure, rather than switch allegiances visibly in a moment of crisis. He stayed with the situation that was already his situation, even when that situation was a four-way standoff with IAA agents and rival FIB personnel and Merryweather helicopters. He fought his way out with Michael. He called in the post-Kortz narrative with Michael. That choice, staying in the existing position under maximum pressure rather than betting on a different affiliation in a moment of chaos, is the choice that killed Sanchez and preserved Dave. Not because Dave was smarter than Sanchez necessarily, because Dave understood that the most dangerous moment to switch sides is the moment when everyone in the room is watching everyone else, and the most valuable thing you can do in that moment is not switch. The standoff at the Kortz Center is worth examining in its geometry, because the geometry tells you something about how quickly a situation built on mutual leverage collapses when one person decides the leverage no longer applies to them. 4 men, each one holding something on every other man in the room. Haines held Dave's fraudulent case file and Michael's fake death. Dave held knowledge of Haines' unauthorized operations that could destroy Haines' career and freedom. Michael held 9 years of documented payments to a federal agent for services that would constitute federal corruption. All 4 of them were, in the language of institutional self-preservation, equally exposed. The standoff should have been stable. The mutual assured destruction of everyone's position should have produced the kind of tense negotiation that ends with everyone agreeing to walk away and pretend the meeting didn't happen. Haines dissolved the standoff by deciding that dead men don't testify. That decision to shoot Sanchez, to run with a bullet in his leg, to accept the chaos of a Kortz Center confrontation rather than the slower and more manageable process of negotiating his way out of it, is the Haines decision that ended Haines, because it forced the situation into a state where Dave and Michael had to fight out of the museum together, which put them in a position of mutual dependency that Dave then leveraged into the post-Kortz narrative he needed to write. If Haines had negotiated, if he'd stayed, if he'd been willing to let the 4-man standoff become a conversation rather than a bloodbath, he would have been alive and in a position of authority over Dave and Michael for however long it took for someone above all of them to sort out what had happened. He might still have lost eventually. The FIB investigation was real, but he'd have had time. He chose the exit and it killed him. Not immediately. Trevor killed him at Del Perro weeks later, but the choice at the Kortz Center is where Steve Haines' story ended, even if the body took longer to catch up. Dave chose to stay. That's the contrast. With Haines shooting and running, Dave could have done the same. A car in the parking level below, a 3-star wanted level he could manage, the same exit available to him that Haines had just used. He didn't take it. He stayed with Michael, helped fight out of the museum, and positioned himself as the man who'd been left holding things together when Haines broke. That positioning, deliberately chosen in the middle of a gunfight at a clifftop museum, is the move that saved Dave Norton's career. Dave arrived first. He picked a pavilion at the upper level, settled in with a newspaper, and waited for Michael to come. Michael arrived and made his position clear immediately. He had done what was asked of him, every job, every operation. Every time Dave or Haines had come to him with a demand, he had met it, including the FIB headquarters raid that was supposed to end the obligation. The deal he'd made in 2004 had been stretched, modified, and expanded by 9 years of payments and then by several months of operational service, and Michael wanted it honored. He wanted the arrangement to end. He wanted to go back to being Michael DeSanta in Rockford Hills, which was not a satisfying existence but was at least a stable one that didn't involve raiding federal buildings or extracting informants from mid-air. Dave started to explain that the situation had developed new complications. He did not finish the sentence. Steve Haines arrived. He arrived with Andreas Sanchez, who had been his operational deputy throughout the period of the missions and who moved like a man who knew exactly what was about to happen and had made his calculation about where to be when it did. Haines was not composed when he came through the Kortz Center entrance. He was scared. not theatrically scared, genuinely scared in the way that men are scared when the institution they've been exploiting for years is closing in on them specifically. The FIB's internal investigation into Haines' unit had advanced to a point where Haines could no longer be confident about who inside the bureau could be trusted to look away. The Kortz Center, in Haines' calculation, was the place to end the problem of having witnesses, Dave and Michael, both of them, arrested on charges that Haines would supply, with Haines as the man who'd identified and brought in the perpetrators of the unauthorized operations, which would conveniently make Haines the man who solved the problem rather than the man who had been the problem. He told Sanchez to move on Dave and Michael. Dave drew on Haines. Michael drew on Haines. Haines drew on both of them. For a moment, a specific held moment of the kind that the game's cutscene direction lingers on, 4 men stood at the Kortz Center's upper pavilion in a geometric arrangement of aimed weapons, each man's position covering at least one other man's position, none of them with a clear action that ended better than the current state. Then the situation expanded beyond all 4 of them. A team of IAA agents arrived through the museum's lower entrance, led by a figure that GTA 5 players with prior GTA 4 experience recognized as the United Liberty Paper Contact, a man whose presence in any situation indicated that what was happening had federal intelligence dimensions that most people in the room hadn't fully accounted for. They came with weapons drawn and with the specific institutional authority of people who were not there to negotiate. A rival FIB tactical team arrived from the opposite direction at approximately the same moment. Not Haines' people. A separate unit, which meant a separate chain of command and a separate set of objectives that did not necessarily include anyone present surviving the outcome. And then, as if the scene required further confirmation that it had escaped the control of everyone who thought they were running it, a Merryweather security helicopter came over the edge of the cliff and held position above the pavilion, its operators presumably operating under the impression that aerial presence would clarify the situation. It did not clarify the situation. Andreas Sanchez chose this precise moment to step away from Haines and announce that he had been a double agent. Not for Haines, for the rival FIB team that had just walked in from the south entrance. Haines asked who had sent them. Sanchez answered. Haines shot Sanchez in the head. The sound of that shot changed everything in the space that followed. One of the rival FIB tactical agents shot Haines in the leg, his left leg, the same leg he'd shot himself in at Humane Labs when he was constructing his double agent cover story, and Haines, bleeding, moving with the determination of a man who has decided that everyone else's survival is a secondary consideration, was gone, out of the Kortz Center, into a vehicle away from the cliff and the museum and the converging agencies and the 3 bodies that were his responsibility. Dave and Michael were left inside a simultaneous engagement with the IAA team, the rival FIB team, and Merryweather aerial support in a museum complex with limited cover and multiple elevation changes that made the geometry of the fight considerably more complicated than any of the operations they'd run over the preceding months. From somewhere across the upper museum complex, a shot rang out. The Merryweather Buzzard's pilot died. The aircraft lost control and went over the cliff edge. Trevor Phillips announced himself to Michael from his sniper position across the pavilions. He said, and this is the line that captures the entire Trevor-Michael relationship in 9 words, "If anyone's going to kill you, old friend, it's going to be me." He was providing cover. He was shooting IAA agents and Merryweather personnel and rival FIB operators to give Dave and Michael a path out, while simultaneously being audibly furious about the entire situation and the specific people he was saving it for. Trevor complained throughout. He complained about Michael, about Dave, about the general stupidity of what had apparently required his airborne rescue skills at a clifftop museum. He killed enemies while delivering this commentary with the efficiency of a man who has done both simultaneously enough times that neither requires the other to stop. Dave crossed the most exposed section of the courtyard. He and Michael reached the parking level below. Dave's instructions to Michael were simple and direct. Take a car, get out of the area, stay off any radar until the heat from the Kortz Center had been processed. Dave took a vehicle and went. The phone call between them came afterward. Michael calling Dave. "I saved you again, Davey, again, so what are you going to do for me?" Dave's answer was the most useful assessment of the available options, framed as something between a plan and an acceptance of what was. History is written by the living. We can pin most of it on Agent Sanchez. If I can get that story right, then the agency and bureau will both back down. The problem we still need to deal with is Trevor. Sanchez was dead. Sanchez could not contradict the story Dave would build around him. A dead double agent, caught inside Haines' unit, responsible for the IAA's access to the Kortz Center meeting, that story was constructible. Haines would have his own version to push, but Haines was running with a bullet in his leg and a witness list that worked against him. Dave had the institutional position. Dave had the proximity. Dave was the surviving FIB agent with the clearest picture of what had happened at the Kortz Center, and a man with that position gets to shape what goes in the file. He had bought time, as he had bought time consistently across the previous 9 years. What he had not solved was Haines or Trevor, two open variables moving in directions Dave could not fully predict or control. Both of them would come to a resolution in the weeks that followed, just not through any mechanism Dave arranged. Trevor's intelligence is worth naming clearly because the way Trevor gets discussed, the violence, the volatility, the behavior that exists so far outside conventional social norms that it tends to dominate how people think about him, sometimes obscures the fact that Trevor Phillips is extremely perceptive. He ran a multi-territory criminal enterprise in Blaine County with genuine operational sophistication. He managed complex supply chains, handled personnel conflicts, navigated relationships with multiple criminal organizations simultaneously, and maintained enough situational awareness that he had survived in one of the most dangerous possible professional environments for years without institutional support or legal protection. Trevor was not an idiot who occasionally did capable things. He was a highly capable person who also happened to be capable of extraordinary violence when circumstances or impulse called for it. That capability, the perceptiveness, the pattern recognition, is what made the Brad correspondence work for 9 years and then stop working, because Trevor's instinct-based intelligence doesn't operate the way analytical intelligence does. It doesn't build a case from evidence and reach a conclusion. It accumulates feelings and then arrives at a certainty, suddenly, like a switch being thrown. The feeling that something was wrong with the Brad letters had been accumulating for years. The feeling that something was wrong with Michael's evasiveness had been accumulating for months. The certainty arrived not when Trevor found a specific piece of evidence, but when the accumulated weight of both feelings became impossible to keep treating as coincidence. Who is in that grave in North Yankton is not the question of a man who has just figured something out. It's the question of a man who already knows the answer and is asking it out loud to make the person across from him say it. Michael didn't say it. And Trevor's response, the stillness, then the declaration, then the car, then Sandy Shores Airfield, was not impulsive in the way Trevor's responses are sometimes characterized as impulsive. It was decided. He had made a decision before he left the house. The decision was that if he flew to North Yankton and dug up a grave and found Brad Snider inside it, the world was going to be organized differently than it had been when he got on the plane. He flew to North Yankton. He dug up the grave. He found Brad Snider inside it. The world reorganized. Trevor's suspicion had been accumulating before any of the 2013 missions began. That's important to understand. The confrontation at the DeSanta house, the moment Trevor asked directly who was in Michael's grave in North Yankton, was not an accusation that arrived without foundation. It arrived at the end of a process, a slow, instinct-driven process of the kind that Trevor operates through, where the analytical surface of the question comes considerably after the emotional awareness that something is wrong. The emotional awareness had been building for years. Part of it was the Brad correspondence, not because Trevor had found anything in the letters that contradicted the story. Dave had managed them too carefully for that. But because correspondence with a person is not the same as presence, and 9 years of letters-only contact with someone you knew as a physical, immediate presence creates a texture that Trevor, on some level, felt as off even when he couldn't name the specific thing that was off about it. The letters felt like Brad, and then didn't. Felt right and then slightly wrong, had the correct emotional register, and then occasionally a sentence that Brad specifically would not have phrased that way. Trevor couldn't have told you, before the grave opened, exactly what was wrong with the correspondence. He just knew that something was. Part of it was Michael. The specific quality of Michael's avoidance of anything directly related to Brad, not distress, not grief, not the uncomplicated sadness of a man whose partner died in front of him, but a kind of careful neutrality that had the shape of something rehearsed rather than felt. Trevor had watched Michael perform calm in high-pressure situations for years and knew what Michael's performed calm looked like. When Brad came up, Michael deployed something similar, not identical, but in the same family. Trevor had been watching for a long time. The conversation at the DeSanta house was where it became explicit. Trevor brought Brad up, mentioned wanting to get him out of prison, talked about it as a plan worth making, a concrete thing, not just sentiment, the way Trevor treats most things he actually wants. And Michael's response was wrong, not flagrantly wrong, wrong in the specific, calibrated way of a man who has been managing this particular deflection for 9 years and is so practiced at it that the management itself has become the tell. Trevor went still. He asked, "Who is in Michael's grave in North Yankton?" Michael said he'd never really given it much thought. Trevor declared Michael a dead man, took Michael's car, and drove for Sandy Shores Airfield. He had made a decision. The decision was that if there was an answer in Ludendorff, he was going to find it, and he was going to find it before whatever protection Michael's evasiveness was providing had a chance to be reinforced. Michael called Dave from the house, hands probably not entirely steady. Trevor was heading for North Yankton. Trevor was going to dig up the grave. Dave Norton, who had been receiving this call in some version in his own imagination for 9 years, received it now, for real. Both men moved at the same time. Michael drove to Los Santos International Airport and went to the ticket desk for the first flight to North Yankton he could buy. Trevor was already at Sandy Shores Airfield, already in the plane that Ron Jakowski had prepped, without fully understanding why, already lifting off while Michael was still parking at the terminal. There was a separate thread running simultaneously, Wei Cheng's men, a Chinese organized crime group that had been negotiating with Trevor's Blaine County operation, attempting to buy into what they believed was Trevor's meth manufacturing capacity, had placed Michael under surveillance based on a fundamental misreading of the relationship between Michael and Trevor. They believed the two men were romantically involved. They planned to use Michael as leverage to compel Trevor's cooperation with their business interests. They followed Michael to the airport. Michael fought through them in the terminal, bought the ticket, boarded the flight. He landed in North Yankton after Trevor. The rental car from Ludendorff's small airport took him through the town. The same Cavalry Boulevard, the same flat North Yankton landscape, the Bobcat depot visible through the tree line if you knew where it was. The road to the cemetery. December now in the game's timeline, close to the same time of year as the original job, the same winter light, the same specific cold that North Yankton carries in its bones. He reached the cemetery and found Trevor at the coffin. The coffin had been dug up, the lid had been opened, and Michael, running toward it, arriving too late to prevent the opening he'd been dreading since Dave told him Trevor was in Sandy Shores, found Trevor standing over the open grave and looking at what was inside it. Brad Snider, 9 years in the ground, still recognizable by the specific detail that Trevor's memory had preserved, a golden tooth. The gold caught what light was available from the grey North Yankton sky and confirmed what the presence of the coffin in Michael's grave had already indicated to Trevor in the moment he got the lid off. He was right. He had been right about something being wrong for a long time, and now he had what being right looked like, tangible and cold and 6 feet underground. Michael tried to explain it. He had a young family. Everyone was going to die eventually in the life they were living, and he'd done what you do when the exit presents itself to the person who survives rather than the person who doesn't. He was sorry about Brad. He'd never meant for Brad to die. Brad wasn't the target. Brad had just moved at the wrong moment. Brad had been in the wrong place relative to a bullet that was meant for the wrong person for a different set of wrong reasons. Trevor pulled a gun. Michael pulled a gun. The two men who had planned jobs together, who had trusted each other for years before 2004 and had spent 9 years not knowing the other was alive, stood over an open grave above the body of their mutual friend and pointed weapons at each other. 9 years of fake letters and managed distance and monthly payments compressed into a 2-gun standoff in a North Yankton cemetery in December. Wei Cheng's men appeared around the perimeter. Trevor threw his gun at Michael. Not as a practical weapon, a pistol thrown across a cemetery is not a tactical move, as a statement, as the physical enactment of throwing away whatever remained of what they'd had, of refusing to hold the connection even in the form of a weapon, of choosing flight over resolution, because resolution had just become impossible. He ran. Michael fired after him, missed, turned back to the triads. He fought through the triads, reached his rental car, found Trevor had disabled it before leaving. Wei Cheng's men took Michael. Dave Norton's phone had the missed call from Michael's airport message. The grave was open in North Yankton. Brad Snider's face was visible to anyone who walked into that cemetery and looked into the hole. The 9-year structure Dave had built, the false correspondence, the managed distance, the file that said Michael Townley was buried in that exact location, had a hole in it that was now literally, physically, undeniably visible. Everything that followed was the consequence of what had been placed in that ground in December 2004, finally becoming impossible to keep down. The approach to Franklin happened on a street in South Los Santos, and it was staged with the specific casualness of federal agents who want a conversation to appear less formal than it is. Haines and Dave materialized in front of Franklin at a moment between crises. Franklin had just returned from the Palito Bay sawmill after pulling Lamar out of a situation that had escalated past anything Lamar had prepared for, and was in the specific emotional state of a man who has been running on adrenaline and is now simply tired. The timing was not accidental. 2 FIB agents approaching a man when he's tired and grateful to still be standing is a better opening than approaching him when he's alert and on his guard. Franklin Clinton's position in this situation is one of the more precisely unfair places GTA 5 puts any of its characters, and it deserves to be named as such. Franklin came into Michael DeSanta's orbit through a car repossession, that's all, a dealership debt, a vehicle, a job that went sideways, and left Franklin with a connection to a person who happened to be the center of a situation so complicated it had been 9 years in the making. From that car and that afternoon, through the Vangelico robbery and Lester's crew, and the introduction to Trevor, and the FIB appearances, and the Blaine County jobs, and the chemical facility, and the Union Depository, Franklin had been moved through an escalating sequence of obligations by people who consistently assumed they were the primary authority in his life. They were consistently wrong about that. Haines and Dave assumed Franklin would execute their instruction because they were federal agents with institutional leverage, with the ability to make Franklin's life very difficult through entirely legal mechanisms if he refused. Weston assumed Franklin would execute his instruction because Weston had 9 figures and a private military company and the specific confidence of a man who has been able to purchase whatever he needed for long enough that he no longer distinguishes between purchasing a thing and deserving it. Neither man had spent time actually understanding what Franklin wanted. They had looked at a young man from Strawberry with a criminal record and a loose network of street connections and made the assessment that people in their positions routinely make about young men from that background, that he could be assigned a task and would perform it, because what were his alternatives? Franklin's alternatives turned out to be considerably more creative than either of them anticipated. What Franklin actually wanted, and this is something the game traces carefully through his dialogues, his arguments with Lamar, his relationship with Michael and Trevor, his complaints about the people who were trying to use him, was an exit from the world he'd grown up in that didn't cost him who he was. He didn't want to become a Haines. He didn't want to become a Weston. He didn't want to be the instrument of powerful people's objectives and get discarded when the instrument was no longer needed. He wanted the door, but he wanted to walk through it on his own terms. Haines and Dave's approach to Franklin, the staged street encounter, the federal weight in the delivery, the instruction presented as if to a subordinate, was built on a category error. They were treating Franklin the way they treated Michael, as someone with enough exposure that the threat of institutional consequences would produce compliance. But Franklin's exposure was manageable in ways Michael's wasn't. Franklin didn't have a fake death and 9 years of fraudulent payments on his record. Franklin didn't have a family and a house paid for partly with stolen money. Franklin was younger, less encumbered, and considerably less trapped by the specific architecture of the situation he'd been pulled into. He called Lester instead of calling either of the numbers he'd been handed. That call changed everything. The message was simple in its delivery and complicated in everything it required. Trevor Phillips had to die. Haines and Dave were presenting this to Franklin as an operational reality, a conclusion that had been reached at a level above Franklin's current understanding of the situation, a decision that had been made and now needed a person to execute it. Haines' framing was about risk and containment. Trevor was an active liability. The events surrounding the Kortz Center, the ongoing federal attention they'd all attracted, the specific unpredictability that Trevor represented in a situation that still had several unsettled elements. These were genuine problems, and Trevor alive was the largest single source of all of them. The argument from Haines was institutional: remove the variable, stabilize the remaining environment, allow the ongoing investigations to settle toward a manageable conclusion. Dave's version of the same argument was different in register and more specific in its honesty. Michael, Dave explained, was a manageable person, not easy, not cooperative by nature, not particularly interested in limiting his own behavior when his own behavior was all that remained from the life he'd had before 2004, but manageable because Michael had things, a family he cared about, however imperfectly, a life in Rockford Hills that he was attached to despite everything it cost him, a relationship with his children that was badly maintained and important to him simultaneously. Michael had reasons to make calculations. Michael could be brought back to a position of stability because stability was in Michael's interest in a way he understood. Trevor had none of those anchors. Trevor had just discovered that his closest long-term partner had allowed his best friend to be buried in a fake grave and had spent 9 years not only concealing that fact but actively sustaining the deception through fraudulent correspondence conducted from a federal office. Trevor's current emotional state, and Dave was being precise here rather than dramatic, was not a controllable one. Trevor's relationship with the concept of consequence had always been different from most people's relationship with it, and Trevor was currently operating with one of the significant losses of his life newly confirmed, and one of the people responsible for that loss living in a house he could drive to in under an hour. Franklin asked the reasonable question, why couldn't Michael be the one to kill Trevor, since Michael was presumably the person with the most direct motivation to prevent Trevor from becoming a problem? Dave's answer came without hesitation. Michael can't do it because Trevor won't allow Michael close enough. That admission is worth more than a simple tactical assessment. It acknowledges directly that the arrangement Dave had built in 2004, the arrangement designed to neutralize Trevor before any of this became complicated, had produced a situation where the two primary people Dave had been managing for 9 years could not solve the central problem between themselves. The variable that was supposed to be eliminated in Ludendorff was now not only alive, but specifically and intelligently vigilant against the people who had been managing him. Trevor was not going to let Michael within operational range of him in the current circumstances. And Dave, who had no direct leverage on Trevor, whose 9 years of fake correspondence were now exposed, whose institutional position meant nothing to Trevor, who had never had any relationship with Trevor beyond attempting to shoot him in 2004, had no mechanism to solve it either. The only available option was a third party. Franklin went home. He was sitting with one impossible demand from 2 federal agents when Devin Weston arrived at his house with the opposite impossible demand. Weston's reasons were his own: the film studio, Molly Schultz, the ongoing list of his business interests that had been damaged by Michael's presence in Weston's operational environment. Weston wanted Michael dead. Franklin should handle it. Weston had the resources to make the alternative very uncomfortable. Franklin, who had come into this entire situation because of a car repossession at the DeSanta house and had spent the subsequent months being moved through an escalating series of obligations by people who assumed they were managing him, was now holding 2 irreconcilable instructions from 2 men who each believed they were the primary power in his life. Neither of them was. The 3 endings of GTA 5 exist at this exact point in the story, and they represent 3 different assessments of what Franklin does when the people above him make demands he didn't sign up for. In Ending A, Franklin kills Trevor. Haines and Dave got what they asked for. The immediate threat is removed, but Dave's position in the aftermath is damaged. The FIB's investigation into the Kortz Center and the broader pattern of Haines' unauthorized operations was still running, and with Haines dead and Dave as the most visible surviving participant, the institutional protection Dave had been operating under was under pressure. He survived the game. He did not emerge cleanly. In Ending B, Franklin kills Michael. Weston got what he asked for. Dave, in the aftermath, sent an email to Trevor, the only surviving member of the original crew, acknowledging the Brad correspondence, promising Trevor's secrets were protected, and making clear that contact between them should never happen again. Dave walked away from a situation that had cost Michael his life, and that Dave had played a role in constructing. Neither of those endings is canonical. The canonical ending is Ending C, and Ending C began when Franklin, instead of calling either of the numbers he'd been handed, called Lester Crest. Lester Crest, who had been watching the situation from the careful remove of a man who understands systems and has no interest in being inside the most volatile part of one, worked the problem. The analysis was not complicated once you had the right information. Steve Haines, under pressure from the FIB's internal investigation, needed to consolidate resources. The most tangible resource that connected Haines to the previous months of operations was the gold from the Union Depository heist. Cash, portable, untraceable if moved quickly. Haines would go for it. Devin Weston, whose relationship with Merryweather Security gave him access to a private military force that had been repeatedly deployed against the protagonists across the course of the game, would also want the gold and would want to be present when whoever was opposing him was finally neutralized. Both men were predictable in the specific way of powerful people who believe their power has no ceiling. They would move toward the resource, and they would use the people they controlled to protect that movement. A foundry in the east of Los Santos. Lester knew the location. He knew the timing. He laid it out. Franklin, Michael, Trevor, and Lamar cleared the foundry. It was the last time the three primary protagonists ran an operation together, and there's something in the texture of that final coordinated job that the game's direction holds onto, even if it doesn't draw attention to it explicitly. These three men, who had been moving in and out of each other's orbits since the DeSanta car repossession more than a year earlier, who had collectively run the Blaine County Bank, the Humane Labs, the FIB headquarters, the Union Depository, and everything in between, ran one more job. It worked. After the foundry, each man went for the target assigned by the logic of the situation. Michael killed Stretch, the gangster whose ongoing interference in Lamar's life had made Franklin's existence considerably more dangerous than it needed to be. Michael tracked him to a funeral home and ended it cleanly, without fanfare. Franklin killed Wei Cheng, settling the Blaine County Territory conflict that had been running alongside the main plot since Trevor's business operations first attracted Cheng's interest. The detail about the underbelly of paradise is the one that keeps landing differently the longer you sit with GTA 5's ending. Steve Haines built the show as part of the architecture of his public identity. A criminal documentary program hosted by a decorated FIB agent reporting on organized crime from the position of someone whose career had been spent opposing it. The show existed to contradict everything else Haines was. It was the face he wore in public that made the face he wore in private feel impossible. Nobody who watched the underbelly of paradise and trusted the man presenting it could easily imagine that same man ordering unauthorized federal operations, running unpaid criminal assets, receiving money from Devin Weston. The show was a lie detector that always read clean. With Haines dead, the FIB needed the slot filled. The institutional logic of it is almost painfully straightforward. The program was a useful communication tool, the brand was established, and the man best positioned to take the chair was the one who had the most credible institutional record attached to the same unit and the same general body of work. That man was Dave Norton. Dave Norton in Steve Haines' chair in front of Steve Haines' camera, presenting himself to Los Santos as the authoritative federal voice on criminal activity. That image completes a loop that the entire story was building toward without anyone quite intending it. The man who built his career on a fiction is now the fiction's inheritor. The man who received 9 years of payments from a wanted criminal is now the weekly face of law enforcement authority on criminal matters. The man who stood at a staged funeral in North Yankton and watched a ceremony for a living person is now, every week, presenting a version of the world to Los Santos that is curated and managed and shaped by his own institutional position, the same skills applied to a smaller screen. There is a version of this that reads as dark comedy. There is a version that reads as pointed institutional critique. Rockstar, who has never been particularly subtle about its views on the relationship between institutional authority and institutional corruption, probably intended both. What matters for Dave's story is simpler. He got the chair. The man whose career began at Unremarkable and whose career-making result was a fiction arrived 9 years later at a nationally broadcast platform from which he presents himself as an authority. The arc that started with an agent nobody was watching ended with an agent everybody in Los Santos was watching every week on their televisions. That is the specific shape of Dave Norton's success. Not a triumph, not a vindication, just a man who managed his situation well enough for long enough that he outlasted everyone around him and inherited whatever they left behind. Trevor found Steve Haines at Del Perro Pier. Haines was filming an episode of The Underbelly of Paradise. The Ferris wheel was turning, the production crew was in position. Haines was on camera, doing the thing he'd been doing since 2008, presenting himself to the Los Santos viewing public as the authoritative, decorated FIB man who had dedicated his career to understanding and reporting on criminal activity in the city. The specific irony of Steve Haines delivering criminal justice commentary while the consequences of his own criminal activity were converging on his location from multiple directions was not lost on anyone with full context. It was not a situation that Haines had designed. It was a situation that found him at the exact moment he was performing his own opposite. Trevor, through Lester's patch into the production's audio feed, listened for a moment. He told Lester he wanted one final reminder of what an annoying person Haines was. Haines delivered. Trevor set up with a sniper rifle at distance from the pier, with the Ferris wheel as the backdrop and the Pacific as the background. He took the shot. Steve Haines died on camera at Del Perro Pier in a moment that was simultaneously broadcast to whatever segment of Los Santos was watching The Underbelly of Paradise on a weekday afternoon. Devin Weston was collected from his Tongva Hills mansion by Trevor, placed in the trunk of his own vehicle, and driven to Palito Cove. Michael and Franklin were there when the car arrived at the cliff above the ocean. The three men pushed it over the edge together. Weston and the vehicle hit the water and detonated. That was the end of the immediate threat. Both men who had been issuing competing demands at Franklin were gone. The FIB's internal investigation would continue, but without Haines as its central subject, it had a different shape. The unauthorized operations could be attributed to the dead. The file could be written by whoever was left with institutional access and a reason to write it a particular way. Dave Norton was not at the Foundry. He was not at Del Perro Pier. He was not at Tongva Hills. He was not present for any of the final sequence of events. Where Dave was during the resolution of the crisis that had been building since the Vangelico robbery, the crisis that had consumed months of his life and pulled him out of the careful managed distance he'd maintained since 2004, the game doesn't specify. He was simply not there. The ending happened without him, around him, at a distance from him, and he survived it the same way he had survived everything else, by being peripheral when the explosions occurred. In the immediate aftermath, when Trevor was making his accounting of who was still alive and what their continued existence represented as a risk, Dave Norton's name came up. Trevor had clear and specific reasons to want Dave dead. Dave had attempted to shoot him in 2004. Dave had spent 9 years deceiving him about the most painful piece of his history. Dave had been the operational contact for the entire 2013 sequence of coerced jobs. Dave was a federal agent with institutional access who, left alive, retained the capacity to create problems for all three protagonists at any future moment. Trevor's position was that Dave should not survive. Michael made the argument against it. The argument was operational and specific. Dave alive was an asset. Dave alive was the FIB agent with the most direct knowledge of the Kortz Center incident, the most institutional access to the case files, the most ability to write the story of the past months in a direction that protected rather than exposed the three of them. Sanchez was already being positioned as the architect of the Kortz Center disaster. Haines was dead. Dave was the surviving senior FIB figure with knowledge of the actual sequence of events, and that made him, paradoxically, the most useful person in the situation was not the person who had done the most damage, but the person who was still alive and still in position to shape what the record said. Trevor did not like this argument. He accepted it. Not warmly, not with any suggestion that he was reconsidering his assessment of what Dave represented or what Dave had done. He accepted it with the specific grudging quality of a man who recognizes that the practical calculation overrides the emotional one in this particular instance, while reserving the right to reach a different conclusion at a later time if the practical calculation shifted. Dave Norton survived Grand Theft Auto V. He is the only FIB agent with direct involvement in the main storyline who does. Sanchez is dead, shot by his own superior at the Kortz Center. Haines is dead, shot by Trevor at Del Perro Pier. Every other figure in the federal machinery that surrounded the three protagonists across the course of the game is either dead or irrelevant to the aftermath. Dave is alive, and Dave is institutionally positioned, and Dave is, in the specific terms of what the situation required in that final accounting, the most useful person still standing. The emails came in the days after the foundry. To Trevor, Dave wrote with the directness that the situation required, and that no amount of careful language could have softened into something comfortable. He acknowledged what Trevor already knew, that he had been composing the responses to Trevor's letters from Brad for 9 years, all of them. Every response Trevor had received from the federal contact point for Brad's fictional incarceration had been managed through Dave's office, written under Dave's direction, calibrated to keep Trevor occupied and away from questions about Ludendorff. Dave told Trevor that his secrets, the ones the FIB now held about Trevor's operations, about his involvement in the events of the past year, were safe. He told Trevor to stop causing problems. He made clear, in language that was not ambiguous, that he never wanted to hear from Trevor again. That email is remarkable for what it contains and doesn't contain. It contains an acknowledgement but not an apology. It contains a promise of silence, but frames it as a mutual arrangement rather than an act of contrition. Dave is not apologizing for 9 years of fraudulent correspondence conducted over his dead friend. He is informing Trevor that the correspondence happened, confirming what Trevor already knew, and establishing the terms under which both men would proceed from here. It is, in its own way, Dave doing what Dave has always done, identifying what each party needs and building a transaction around those needs, without sentiment and without more exposure than the transaction requires. To Michael, Dave told him to stay out of trouble. He mentioned, in a tone that the game's text conveys as almost offhand, that he had been named the new host of The Underbelly of Paradise, Steve Haines' slot, Steve Haines' show. The television program that Haines had been hosting since 2008, the platform he'd used to construct a public identity of federal authority and criminal justice expertise while running unauthorized operations behind it, was being continued, and the FIB had assigned it to Dave Norton, the unremarkable agent from the Midwest, whose career had been described by Lester Crest as producing nothing worth noting before December 2004, would now appear on Los Santos television every week to report calmly and knowledgeably on the criminal underworld of the city. Having spent the preceding 9+ years as an active participant in the corruption of a federal agency, the recipient of monthly payments from a wanted criminal, a co-conspirator in the cover-up of a fatal shooting, a participant in a Blaine County bank robbery, and an operational asset in an unauthorized campaign against a rival federal agency, Dave Norton would now present himself to Los Santos as the institutional voice of law enforcement expertise. That is either the most perfectly calibrated joke Rockstar ever put into a game or the most precise observation they've ever made about how institutions actually work, how the people who survive institutional corruption are not always the ones who were least corrupt, but the ones who were most useful to whatever version of the institution emerged from the collapse. The show needed a host. Dave was the FIB agent still standing. The resume got him the slot. He called Michael after sending the email. The call is in the game as a post-story contact. Dave reaching out to Michael the way a man reaches out to someone he's been bound to for a decade when the crisis is finally over and what remains is the relationship itself, whatever that relationship actually is. He asked about Michael's family, said his own work was good, said he'd had a few lucky breaks. Michael said he was glad, said he'd keep himself out of trouble. Both men said take care of yourself. They hung up, and here is where the circle closes. Back to the opening question, back to the words this script started with. Who killed Michael Townley? The official answer, the one that built Dave's career and funded the subsequent 9 years of his life, and sat in a federal file as the outcome of a successful interdiction operation in North Yankton. Dave Norton, FIB Special Agent, December 2004, Ludendorff. That was never true. Dave didn't kill Michael Townley. He helped Michael Townley cease to exist by providing the mechanism through which Michael Townley could become someone else. He took credit for a kill that wasn't a kill, accepted monthly payments to sustain the fiction of that non-kill, spent 9 years managing the correspondence of the dead man who had accidentally taken the bullet he'd actually fired, and survived the exposure of every element of that structure by being, at the critical moment, more valuable alive than dead. Now look at who didn't survive. Steve Haines, who had a decorated career, a television show with a genuine audience, a unit of his own, connections to one of the wealthiest men in Los Santos, died on camera at a public pier, shot by a man he'd been trying to use as an asset for months. Devin Weston, a billionaire with a private military force and enough institutional reach to apply pressure at the federal level, went over a cliff in the trunk of his own car, pushed by 3 men he'd underestimated for different and overlapping reasons. Andrea Sanchez, who had managed to sustain a double agent position inside one of the FIB's most actively corrupt units, was shot by his own superior officer in the middle of a clifftop museum standoff, 3 seconds after revealing who he was working for. Brad Snider, who had never known the terms of the deal that resulted in his death, died in the snow in North Yankton because he stepped into a line of fire that wasn't meant for him. Dave Norton read a newspaper at a museum pavilion, had a 4-man standoff he walked away from, managed the story afterward, and became the host of a television program. That is not a coincidence. That is a specific kind of intelligence operating in a specific kind of way. Dave never reached for more than the current situation required. He never tried to consolidate power beyond his immediate position. He never made the mistake of believing that the fictions he built were permanent rather than conditional. When fictions became untenable, he didn't double down on them, he adjusted them. When leverage changed hands, he moved with the leverage rather than against it. When the choice was between being useful and being principled, he chose useful every time, which is the choice that keeps you alive inside an institution as corrupt as the one he was operating in. That's not moral advice. Dave Norton is not an aspirational figure. He covered up a killing, deceived a grieving man for 9 years through fraudulent correspondence conducted from a federal office, and participated in the coercion of 3 people into serving an unauthorized federal operation for months. The things he did are clear, and they are in the record, or would be if the record were honest, which it is not, because Dave is the man writing the record, but survival is its own specific kind of outcome, and in Grand Theft Auto 5, which populates its world with men and women who reach for things they cannot hold, Haines for institutional invulnerability, Weston for untouchable wealth, Sanchez for the double life that eventually halves you, Dave Norton stands as the person who didn't reach. He maintained, he managed, he made himself useful, he survived. The question at the beginning of this script was who killed Michael Townley? The real answer is that nobody killed Michael Townley. Dave Norton created the conditions under which Michael Townley ceased to exist on paper, and Michael DeSanta took his place, and a man named Brad Snider was placed in the gap between those 2 identities and has remained there since December 2004. Dave built the gap. He maintained it. He survived its exposure. He outlasted everyone, the host of the underbelly of paradise, the only man who walked out, the unremarkable agent from the Midwest who became, by the end of the story that he started, the last federal agent standing in the aftermath of a corruption that he helped construct and survived by managing to be perpetually, unerringly, almost artistically useful to whoever was still in position to destroy him. That is Dave Norton's story. It is not a story of justice or its absence exactly. It is a story about what happens inside institutions when the institution's corruption becomes systemic enough that survival requires operating within the corruption rather than against it, and about the specific, unglamorous, durable competence of a man who understood that truth from the beginning and never lost sight of it, the only man who walked out. And somewhere in Los Santos, the Ferris wheel at Del Perro keeps turning, and the underbelly of paradise airs on schedule, and Dave Norton sits in the chair that Steve Haines vacated and reports on the criminal underworld of the city with the particular authority of a man who has spent 20 years inside it. If this is the kind of story you settle in for, the characters behind the characters, the architecture underneath the missions, the people who built the world that Michael and Trevor and Franklin moved through, there's more where this came from. The next deep dive is already on your screen. Click it, get comfortable, and stay with it. Sleep well,